Chapter 663. After returning to his dormitory, Dake had mixed feelings, but he quickly calmed down. The case of the Duke's mansion was very special, and there were certain hidden dangers, but it also showed that humans were not pigs and sheep that could be slaughtered at will. In the end, times had changed. History could be used as a reference, but it could not be blindly followed. If humans were given a few more decades to develop, even if the gods descended, they might be stunned. As the situation gradually became clearer, many people around the world were already responding. In fact, Dake Dimming had already started preparing for Ragnarok more than a year ago. He had indeed suppressed the demon god's revival. This was obviously a great achievement. Time flew by, and in the blink of an eye, it was next Thursday. The first website was https://m. VIP can't you? VIP during Professor Kazayer's alchemy class. Dake specially brought Meow Meow into the class and set up a support sculpture. In just 1.5 hours, he had completed the creation of another imitation golem. Although the essence of this golem was still a poor imitation, its appearance was already very exquisite. Its outline and the moon god armament seemed to be made from the same mold. After Meow Meow helped him create this golem, it had been meowing around him all day, constantly asking him when the god personality armament for greed would be completed. Dake laughed dryly, not wanting to answer this kind of question that did not make any sense. In the afternoon of the same day, he continued his research on the second refinement, and finally succeeded in creating the third 3-star, illusory beast, Ibu. Since last Friday he had spent more time on paper research, so he had only used 22 illusory beast hairs, and now there were 8 illusory beast hairs left. Of course, 8 illusory beast hairs could be used up in an hour of research. Therefore, after the alchemy class, he had pre-ordered a new illusory beast hairs from Professor Kazayer, and at the same time that he successfully created his third 3-star illusory beast, Ivan, he also created his first 3-star illusory beast, ever-changing monster. For this reason, the 2 3-star fantasy beast, multiform monster, had been deconstructed and consumed by him. The multiform monster was now back to its original 1-star skin. In fact, Ibu-chan's initial skin had never been thrown away. She treasured it very much and kept it in her own little box. Whenever he was in the mood, he would put on the primordial skin and become a newbie. After Dake successfully created the 3-star fantasy beast, multiform monster, he summoned multiform monster over and transferred the main body's consciousness so that it could try it out. After the polymorph changed into a 3-star skin, it immediately performed a set of rubber fists that Wang Lufei had taught it. Dake communicated with it while injecting magic power to check the information of the magic card. Card name, Fantasy Beast Ever-Changing Monster. Type, Elf card. Level, *****. Race, Elemental. Attribute, Normal magic power, 1250 attack, 1250 defense, 1250 ultimate skill. Shapeshifter, Transform. The 3-star fantasy beast, multiform monster, had a huge increase in its 3 attributes. It was completely capable of confronting most of the 3-star magic elves head-on. Moreover, ever since it had the 2-star fantasy beast, multiform monster had been developing its ultimate skill, Transform. In other words, now that it was more familiar with the complete transformation, it was researching partial transformation. For example, it could turn its arm into a dragon's claw or a cannon on its shoulder. Once the research on partial transformation was successful, when there were 2 or more magic elves in front of it, it would be able to take advantage of their strengths and avoid their weaknesses. From there, it would obtain a powerful ability that surpassed the target it was imitating. It was very difficult to develop such an ultimate skill, but multiform monster was never tired of it. Recently, it had fallen in love with the head of little Dake. Then it would run around with little Dake's head, helping the dream demon to quickly replenish its fear energy. Let's not talk about it. The 3-star fantasy beast, multiform monster, undoubtedly had the ability to cause a qualitative change. Dake took out Pride 2, Pride 3, and Pride X one by one. Then he said something to multiform monster, and began the next step of the experiment. First of all, although it had been confirmed long ago Pride 2 had completely lost its effect on the 3-star Fantasy Beast, Multiform Monster. Dake had a premonition that the Great Sin 2 could only be used to change Fantasy Beast, Earbook's field skills, or to help Curse Cage, Subbeast evolve into various subspecies. However, the biggest reason for Great Sin 2's existence was to help him establish the foundation of different Great Sins. After all, only the second-grade Great Sin card could manifest the emblem of a Great Sin. Dake used Pride 3 again. The 3-star Fantasy Beast, Multiform Monster, suddenly underwent a drastic change. As the dark golden light was completely absorbed by the red emblem on its forehead, the Fantasy Beast, Multiform Monster, star level rose to 6-star without a doubt. Card name, Fantasy Beast Multiform Monster. Type, Elven card. Level, Race, Elemental. Attribute, Normal Magic Power, 2500. Attack, 2500. Defense, 2500. Killer Skills, Shapeshifter Transformation. Although it did not have any killer skills other than Transformation, the attributes of the 6-star Fantasy Beast, Multiform Monster, were enough to allow it to complete a complete turnaround. Its magic power, attack, and defense were all as high as 2,500 points. If it were to transform into any 6-star Elven monster, it might even suffer a loss. In that case, the importance of partial transformation was even greater. If it could partially transform into the body parts that the opponent used to unleash their killer skills while maintaining its 3 measurements, that would be true freedom. If it did not use the killer skill transformation, and only used its daily normal transformation, the multiform monster could also transform into its human form and unleash its boxing, swordsmanship, and other skills. If it was equipped with the single scabbard, even if it could not activate the power of the Holy Sword, it would still be a powerful combat power. In its human form, it could even equip various types of armor or equipment that required its body shape. At the end of the experiment, Dake tried out Pride. However, this incomplete version of Pride was indeed unable to improve Fantasy Beast, Multiform Monster. The applicability of Fantasy Beast, Multiform Monster, had an unprecedented increase. If he could store 3 Fantasy Beast, ever-changing monster cards in the deck, the effect might not be inferior to 3 Fantasy Beast, Earbook cards. In addition to successfully refining a 3-star Fantasy Beast, Multiform Monster, Dake also successfully refined a second 2-star Fantasy Beast, Fantasy Sheep, and the first 2-star Fantasy Beast, Fusion Incantation Creature, Dragon. Card name, Fantasy Beast Fusion Incantation Creature, Dragon. Type, Elven card. Level, Race, Elemental. Attribute, Dragon. Magic power, 500. Attack, 500. Defense, 500. Killer skills, Fusion Finger Dragon Fusion, Fusion Finger, Fusion Incantation Creature. Dragon can replace a recorded fusion material that does not exceed the second tier to participate in the fusion. At this time, the fusion material other than the dragon must be the real fusion material. Dragon Fusion, including the fusion materials indicated by Fusion Curse Creature, Dragon. Offer this set of fusion materials as a sacrifice, and you can summon the corresponding dragon magic guide spirit of this set of fusion materials. Fantasy Beast, Fusion Incantation Creature, Dragon, could replace the second-tier fusion material card for fusion. If the final fusion was a dragon magic elven, there was no need to use the fusion card, and it could be directly summoned. For Dake, who only had 1 fusion card, this was the cornerstone of the fusion card deck. Dake almost immediately ordered it to record the information of Curse Cage, Subbeast, and Green-Eyed Baby Dragon. Let's not talk about whether it was suitable for a magic duel. In an actual battle, relying only on Fantasy Beast, Fusion Incantation Creature, Dragon could fuse Green-Eyed Baby Dragon into Green-Eyed Explosive Baby Dragon, which was very important for an encounter. If the fusion card was used, the Green-Eyed Baby Dragon and the 2-star Fantasy Beast, Fantasy Sheep, could be fused together into Green-Eyed Explosive Baby Dragon. With this, the Green-Eyed Explosive Baby Dragon's duration would be increased from 15 minutes to 30 minutes. Basically, it could deal with most of the actual battles. Dake could not wait to explore the secret passage or the underground city. However, for a magister, just the increase of the highest combat power was still far from enough. After he finished the second refinement research, he was ready to immerse himself in the creation of the new magic elven card. Anyway, let's use up the last 8 fantasy beast hairs first. With the idea of making the best use of everything, Dake began his experiment again. After more than an hour, he had 8 new 1-star fantasy beast cards in his hands. Among these 8 new 1-star illusionary beast, other than 2 being illusionary beast, Ivan, there were 2 more that were illusionary beast, multiform monster. One was illusionary beast, fantasy sheep. One was illusionary beast, demon beast king of the swamp. One was illusionary beast, curse fusion creature, dark. And the last one was illusionary beast, god of destruction. The creation of fantasy beast, god of destruction, surprised Dake. He could clearly feel a weak divinity from this card that was very similar to fantasy beast, goddess of the heart's eye. This meant that this was the foundation of another god card. Ever since I created 2 fantasy beast, goddess of the heart's eye cards in a row, I haven't been able to create a third one. I didn't expect to have a new harvest. After Dake washed it, he immediately infused his magic to check it out. In Yu-Gi-Oh! There was a monster card that was similar to Goddess of the Heart's Eye. It was Vasego, the god of destruction. In the legends, Vasego was the 3rd demon god among the 72 demon gods of King Solomon. He was a noble son with a kind heart and ruled over 26 armies. His duty was to announce the past and the future, and to search for all hidden and lost things. However, this magic card that Dake created was not named Vasego. Its card face was completely different from Vasego, the god of destruction. It could only be said that it was a second creation based on the original game. As a counterpart to Fantasy Beast, Goddess of the Heart's Eye, Fantasy Beast, god of destruction, S card face was an enchanting woman with long black hair. It was the complete opposite of Goddess of the Heart's Eye, S elegant and calm temperament. Its body was wrapped in intertwined white bandages that perfectly accentuated its beautiful figure. The most distinctive feature of his body was his pair of long and narrow eyes that were completely black from the pupil to the whites of his eyes. The Fantasy Beast, god of destruction, on the card face had its eyes open and was emitting an extremely dangerous aura. Card name: Fantasy Beast, god of destruction. Type: Elf card. Level: Race: Devil. Attribute: Dark. Magic: 100, Attack: 100, Defense: 100, Ultimate Skill: Fusion Finger. Devil Fusion. It was the complete opposite of Fantasy Beast, Goddess of the Heart's Eye. Fantasy Beast, god of destruction. S race was a devil and its attribute was dark. It had Devil Fusion as one of its ultimate skills. Dake continued to infuse his magic to check it out and obtain the specific information of Devil Fusion. Devil Fusion. The god of destruction can replace any second-tier dark type or Devil Fusion material and participate in the fusion. At this time, the fusion material other than the god of destruction must be the real fusion material. This meant that as long as he recorded the information of Curse Cage, Heidi Road Beast, this fantasy beast, god of destruction, could replace Curse Cage, Heidi Road Beast, and fuse with Heidi Road Beast to evolve into Basti Beast. Compared to using the Fantasy Beast, Goddess of the Heart's Eye, and the Curse Cage, Heidi Road Beast to evolve into the Basti Beast, using the combination of the Fantasy Beast, god of destruction, and the Diru Beast was obviously more convenient and faster. Dake was slightly excited. Judging from the Fantasy Beast, Goddess of the Heart's Eye, S situation, its enhanced divinity was enough to support it in the frequent fusion, evolution and removal of fusion. Therefore, activating the Fantasy Beast, god of destruction, S intelligence would not bring about any negative effects. After Dake thought about it, he took out the Bliss 3 from his card pack and was ready to activate its intelligence immediately. He was already guessing what kind of new ultimate skill would be obtained after the deification of this magic card. Although the Fantasy Beast, Goddess of the Heart's Eye, S2 ultimate skills were not suitable for combat, they were very useful outside of combat. I hope this god of destruction can also be hardened. With that in mind, he picked up the fantasy beast, god of destruction, and began to summon it on the spot. In the name of Dake Dimming, I summon the fantasy beast, god of destruction. After only 3 seconds, the fantasy beast, god of destruction was summoned. Similar to the fantasy beast, goddess of the heart's eye, as height, the fantasy beast, god of destruction was also over 1.7 meters tall. Its feet were simply wrapped in 2 bandages, and it was almost barefoot. However, compared to the goddess of the heart's eye's narrow-mindedness, its heart was obviously broader, and even a little too dark and deep. The white bandages that hung down from its waist tightly wrapped around its slender legs, tightly revealing some unnoticeable pale skin. After being summoned for the first time, it did not have any reaction. It just stood straight like a delicate doll. Dake carefully sized it up, trying his best to adapt to this scene in advance so that he could prevent Bliss from going berserk. After he had a better understanding of the fantasy beast, god of destruction's physique, Dake picked up Bliss 3 and began to summon it. In the name of Dake Dimming, I summon the Bliss 3. Pink light instantly sprinkled down, completely enveloping the black-haired woman that was emanating a dangerous and seductive aura. The Bliss emblem slowly appeared in between its brows, and its eyes closed subconsciously. All the light was then sucked into the Bliss emblem and poured into its body, dyeing it with the color of a demon from the inside out. Its slightly stiff limbs instantly softened. Black mist slowly seeped out from under its bandages, and an increasingly dangerous aura slowly spread out. Dake was slightly alarmed, and his eyes became serious. Illusory beast, god of destruction, was indeed worthy of the title, god of destruction. Its aura was filled with the aura of destruction, and it was extremely similar to the aura released by Green Eye's inferior white dragon, as destructive white jet. The almost undetectable divine aura on its body was also enhanced under the Bliss 3's effect. A faint black glow appeared on the fantasy beast, god of destruction's long black hair, making it even more gorgeous and seductive. When the light dimmed, it slowly opened its eyes, and the first thing it did was to look at Dake's face. When their eyes met, Dake felt that something was wrong. The aura from the fantasy beast, god of destruction, was as dangerous as the abyss. In the blink of an eye, his cheeks were clamped by the abyss, and he could not help but feel suffocated. Bliss +1. Dake had no choice but to use the fantasy beast, god of destruction, to stand aside as punishment. He then picked up the fantasy beast, god of destruction's magic card and realized that it was emitting a faint golden halo. It had indeed transformed into a gold card. "Can you speak?" Dake asked as usual. "Yes, master," the fantasy beast, god of destruction, said politely. Dake nodded slightly, and continued to infuse magic into the magic card. A moment later, he received information from the magic card. Card name, Fantasy Beast God of Destruction. Type, Elven card. Level, Race Devil. Attribute, Dark. Magic Power, 100. Attack, 100. Defense, 100. Ultimate Skills, Fusion Finger, Devil Fusion. Annihilation Announcement. Lost Prophecy. Similar to the Fantasy Beast, Goddess of the Mind's Eye, the Fantasy Beast, God of Destruction, had also received 2 new ultimate skills. Although these 2 ultimate skills did not have the word God in them, one could still tell that they were rare and valuable just by looking at their names. Annihilation Announcement. Lost Prophecy. Are they all prophetic abilities? Dake thought for a while, and continued to infuse magic into it to examine it further. Annihilation Announcement. The God of Destruction's eyes can look directly into the past and the future, and can see the end of destruction. Annihilation Announcement. Announce the time of death of a target. Once the announcement is made, the target will not be healed, and all damage received will not be recovered. If the announcement is successful, the God of Destruction will temporarily gain control of the target's soul. The more accurate the time of announcement, the more power the target's soul will inherit. Magic Power +500, Hypostasis +1. Constant, Magic Power +500, and Hypostasis +1. What a difficult ultimate skill. Dake could not help but look up at the Fantasy Beast, God of Destruction, that was being punished, and the latter immediately threw him a flirtatious look. The annihilation announcement. Effect of preventing the target's ability to recover was secondary, and the god of destruction's soul that was obtained after the announcement was successful was the real core. Especially in a magic duel where every second counted. It was too easy to announce the time of death of a fantasy beast. If it was accurate to the minute, it could basically be guessed correctly. The more difficult part was actually to be accurate to the second. But that was too difficult, and the normal time should be between 1 to 10 seconds. I just don't know how long the god of destruction will last, whether the soul can be used as a sacrifice, and what percentage of power will be inherited. This ultimate skill must have a very long cooldown, and it will be very difficult to test. Anyway, let's take a look at the next ultimate skill. The next ultimate skill. Lost Prophecy. Lost Prophecy. The god of destruction's eyes can look directly into the past and the future, and can find all lost items. Make a prophecy on a lost item, and confirm its location and time when it will appear at that location. Magic power plus 500, hypostasis plus 1. An ultimate skill for finding lost items. Dake took a deep breath. Unlike the god's eye that could find gods, the lost prophecy of the fantasy beast, god of destruction, was more down to earth. Whether it was helping an old lady find a lost key, or helping a child find a lost cat, it was a good way to use it. Dake touched his chin and thought carefully, then suddenly looked up and asked, "Your prophecy, must it be an item that the target once owned?" The fantasy beast, god of destruction, said slowly, "After all, the target once owned it, but it doesn't have to be an item." "Not just objects?" Dark raised his eyebrows and said, "Don't tell me you can also find lost emotions." But the fantasy beast, god of destruction, nodded and said, "That's what my heart tells me. Of course, things that don't exist can't be found. Also, a lost prophecy isn't necessarily accurate, and there's a chance of it failing. I only know how to use it, but I don't know what it means." Dake nodded. "That's normal." Then he changed the topic and smiled. "So you have the gift of prophecy?" The fantasy beast, god of destruction, frowned and thought for a moment. "I think so." Dake clapped his hands and said, "Very good. I'll arrange for you to learn as soon as possible. I hope you can work hard in the name of a god, and become a real prophet as soon as possible." Fantasy beast, god of destruction. Dake started to summon the moon god's soul and the fantasy beast, goddess of the heart's eye. Of course, before learning divination, he had to teach the fantasy beast, god of destruction, some basic knowledge. He hoped that the heavy academic pressure could crush it, or else Dake would be crushed by it. Then Dake summoned a fantasy beast, fantasy sheep, that he had just refined and started to calculate the annihilation proclamation. The first thing he did was to make a precise announcement and destroy the fantasy beast, fantasy sheep, within 1 second of the announcement. The result was much better than he expected. After the fantasy beast, fantasy sheep, was destroyed, the fantasy beast, god of destruction, summoned the soul of the fantasy beast, fantasy sheep. "How much?" Dake asked. The fantasy beast, god of destruction, looked at it and said proudly, 100%. Dake asked again, "Does it include the ultimate skill? Can it be used as a sacrifice?" The fantasy beast, god of destruction, said, "It includes the ultimate skill, but I can't see if it can be used as a sacrifice." Dake nodded and said, "That's not hard to test." He then put the fairy Earbook back into the magic card and summoned a 3-star, fantasy beast, changeable monster, to perform a sacrificial summoning on the spot. It went well. The soul of the fantasy sheep was indeed useful as a sacrifice. The main point of the sacrificial summoning was that after the successful summoning, the relationship between the soul and the sacrifice would be completely severed. Therefore, there was no need to worry about the fantasy beast, fantasy sheep, as soul arriving after that. In fact, the fantasy beast, fantasy sheep, as soul could last for a full 3 minutes, which was a full 6 rounds. That was already very comfortable. Now let's see how long the cooldown is. If it's within an hour, maybe we can do an accurate test before the astrology class starts. Dake held the fairy Earbook in his arms and used its soft, Pink paused to play a little game of high-fiving. Then he suddenly had an idea and said, "Wait, the god of destruction's eyes can see the past and the future. What if the so-called announcement of destruction is made after the target is killed? Furthermore, how can the announcement be made within 1 second after the target is killed?" Dake frowned, and an image quickly appeared in his mind. The fantasy beast, god of destruction, that had been strengthened a second time pounced like the wind, killing the target and passing by it. It then held its weapon upside down and sneered softly, "You're already dead." Then the soul of the dead target slowly stood up the moment it heard this sentence. Hiss. Goosebumps. Dake couldn't help but look at the fantasy beast, god of destruction, again and couldn't help but mutter, "Human form, can wear most armor and weapons. Mana 1100, hypostasis +2, equivalent to 3-star. If I use a weapon card to stack attack and defense. Although it might be troublesome, it was very cool. Let's test whether the announcement can be made after death in the next round." An hour later, the cooldown of the announcement of destruction finished, and Dake really did test the announcement after death. However, it wasn't a test that was accurate to the second, but to the minute. The fantasy beast, god of destruction, only had 100 attack points, and if he wanted to personally destroy the fantasy beast, fantasy sheep, he had to equip the sickle cutter dagger. On the 59th second after the fantasy beast, fantasy sheep, was killed, the fantasy beast, god of destruction made a decisive announcement. In the voice that said, "You're already dead," the soul of the fantasy beast, fantasy sheep, was summoned. It really works. Dake couldn't help but be overjoyed. The ability to announce the future and the ability to announce the past were two completely different concepts. The ability to announce the past could easily be accurate to the second, which meant that the soul of the dead would have 100% of the ability of the dead. This was practically a replica of the resurrection of the dead. This made the fantasy beast, god of destruction, a qualitative leap in its practicality. After the announcement of destruction was made, it would be offered as a sacrifice for the fusion, and every drop of its value would be squeezed dry. However, in a complicated environment, it wasn't easy to make an announcement that was accurate to the second. After the fantasy beast, god of destruction, carefully observed the soul of the fantasy beast, fantasy sheep, it said, "The ultimate skill is still intact, but the effect and power of the ultimate skill have been reduced, and its strength has been reduced to about 1/3 of its original strength. The announcement that was delayed by 1 minute is only 1/3 of its strength left?" Dake frowned slightly and said, "Then what about half a minute? Half, or how much?" The fantasy beast, god of destruction, shook its head and said, "I'm not sure. The specific strength seems to be mixed in with some other factors, so it can't be calculated purely based on the time ratio." Dake nodded and said, "Then let's do this for now. Let the moon god's soul and the fantasy beast, goddess of the heart, take you to the club's classroom to choose an empty room. Or you can live with someone between them." The fantasy beast, god of destruction, immediately showed a disappointed expression. "Can't I live here? I saw a lot of beds over there. Although it's a little small, I can squeeze in. You're only 1.7 meters tall, and you want to squeeze into a small bed with those little cuties? Who knows where you'll be squeezed?" Dake glared at it and said, "You don't have to squeeze. No matter how powerful I am, I can't provide you with magic power in your dreams. When it's time to sleep, I'll temporarily put you back into the magic card." Illusory beast, god of destruction, felt even more dejected. After Dake handed her over to the two seniors, he began to prepare for the astrology class that night. Although he wasn't very talented in astrology, he was serious and diligent enough to master a lot of basic knowledge. He already felt that his level had increased significantly, and he could soon start to study the magic array of love and make the flower card. The growth of bliss was becoming more and more difficult to stabilize, and after making the flower card, he could make bliss fall from the danger line at a critical moment. That was Dake's previous thought. Until now, he suddenly became more interested in the flower card. Since the moon goddess statue can absorb the power of bliss from the emotions of the students through the flower card, why can't I? It was basically because of this thought. Moreover, he had the moon god's soul in his hand, which could be said to be the terminal to receive the moon god's version of bliss. And unlike the previous moon goddess statue, the moon god's soul was a soul that belonged to him completely. With this as the foundation, the moon god's version of bliss might be more similar to his own bliss. In addition, this idea could be used on other types of great sins. Researching and making the flower card was only the first step. The ultimate goal was to master this method and combine alchemy and magic technology to make the flower card of other great sins. Even if this kind of behavior didn't conform to the rules. But as long as he could make it successfully, he could use the payment mechanism to obtain it with money. An appropriate extraction of desire and an appropriate extraction of blood were beneficial to the body. Of course, to make the flower card of other great sins, he first needed a terminal similar to the moon god's soul. On the night of the full moon, Professor Mitya finally taught a practical class that could immerse the students in it. After the astrology class ended, Dake conducted the third annihilation announcement test in the Magical Animals Society. This time, the test delayed the announcement by half a minute. Without any interference, the test result was indeed around half. Based on this estimation, annihilation announcement's effect would decrease after more than a minute, but the summoned souls might not be enough to be used as sacrifices. And after a few minutes, annihilation announcement's effect should completely disappear. Dake didn't continue to stay in the Magical Animals Society to conduct the test. Instead, he left the dorm after recording. Tomorrow was Friday, and he would be facing his first fifth-year student since his debut. In order to have a higher chance of winning, he planned to refine a new magic fairy tonight. As for the goal of refining, he had already thought about it. At the Halloween masquerade ball, he obtained a total of 2 soul orbs. One of them was of lower quality, while the other was of higher quality. He planned to use the higher quality soul orb to refine a specter-type magic fairy. His target was Soroya or Onishi's family. As for the fruit of great sins, it was the fruit of bliss from the foxgrass. As for the other lower quality fruit, he didn't plan to use the fruit of bliss. Instead, he wanted to try his luck and only put in 1 to 3 drops of fruit of bliss to complete the basic refinement. This way, he could ensure that the final magic fairy would be compatible with bliss, and he could also save some money. Even if he didn't use the fruit of bliss, he would still need to add a secondary material to refine it. The final magic fairy's strength couldn't be guaranteed. He needed to brainstorm. Tonight, he would use the lower quality soul orb from the Dark Mummy as the core to refine it. 84 of 139 9,000 chapters. Good night, brothers. It's the last 2 days. Brothers, cast your monthly votes and blades. If you don't, it'll expire. Monthly votes, monthly votes. Chapter 664. Dake couldn't remember the last time he didn't use the fruit of great sin as an auxiliary material to create a magic guide fairy. After he prepared all the materials, he was a little excited. The rise of pay-to-win methods like card drawing and opening boxes wasn't without reason. Almost everyone had a gambler's mentality. Come to think of it, he used the most basic method to create a magic guide fairy like Kettle. Of course, most of them were Trash Slime, Hawkman, Ball Sea Lion, and so on. Compared to the magic guide fairy created with the fruit of great sin as an auxiliary material, they weren't strong enough. The reason was that the fruit of great sin contained complete biological factors that could increase the realism of the magic guide fairy. Secondly, the fruit of great sin strengthened the 7 points of great sin to a 10 points of great sin through life breeding. Adding the fruit of great sin to create a magic guide fairy was equivalent to adding 10 points of great sin. The Hawkman wrestling didn't use great sin, and the Ball Sea Lion only used 2 bliss roots. The final result was obvious. Remember the website VIP, can't you? 6. Even if the magic guide fairy relied on great sin card to gain more strength, it couldn't be ruled out that the Ball Sea Lion's initial form was too weak. However, the soul bead from the Dark Mummy was relatively low in quality, but that was only in comparison. After all, it was a drop from a 7-star ghost, and the specter energy it contained was relatively pure and dense. Therefore, Dake still had expectations for it. Even if I can't create a 7-star magic guide fairy, a 5-star or 6-star magic guide fairy would be good enough. Using evolution to increase the strength of the cards was feasible in a short magic guide duel, but once it became a battle of attrition, the drawbacks of only 15 minutes of evolution time would be revealed. Although Dake could use perfect time management to ensure that there would be high-strength magic guide fairy cards at every stage, it was equivalent to giving up the advantage of a magister in numbers. This situation was already reflected in the previous exploration of the dungeon. He basically relied on the Diru beast and the lion beast that wielded the holy sword to obtain the ability to fight for a long time. Thus, his main goal in the future was to refine a high-star magic guiding fairy. Even if this high-star elven elf might not be able to be used in a magic duel, Rise of the Gods meant that it was imperative to improve its combat prowess. Dake picked up the apple juice from Kettle, pursed his lips, and focused on the experiment. Even though he had not used the basic refining method for a long time, it did not slow down his hand speed. In just half an hour, Dake had reached the last step of the foundational cultivation. He looked at the number 1 alchemy formation that was about to unfold. First, he threw in some auxiliary materials related to the specter element that he had prepared beforehand. Then he used the technology that he had recently mastered to adjust the environment so that the direction of the refinement was closer to the specter element. Then he took out the soul bead that had been properly processed and took a look. The inside of the soul bead was shrouded in gray fog. Upon closer inspection, it looked like a ghost's face. Faint ghostly cries could be heard, causing one to shudder. If it was in the previous era, this item would definitely be classified as a cursed item. However, in the eyes of a magus, the attributes of the materials were only attributes. Dake took a deep breath and slowly placed the soul bead that the 7-star dark mummy dropped into the number 1 alchemy formation. As the soul pearl came into contact with the light array, ripples began to spread out. He used his other hand to hold the mana pen and pointed it at a corner of the formation. He injected mana into it and adjusted it accordingly, slowly but surely refining the soul bead. His mana continued to increase, allowing him to refine high-grade materials with ease. In the end, Dake still did not know which auxiliary material to add to the refinement. In the end, he decided to leave the results of the refinement to randomness. As the quality of the materials increased, the number of great sins that the alchemy formation could contain increased as well. Dake picked up the magic brain dropper and extracted 1 point of bliss from the thinking bottle that he had prepared beforehand. He then dripped it into the alchemy formation. As the magic brain dropper screeched, 3 points of bliss were dripped into the formation. The light released by the number 1 alchemy formation had finally reached its peak. The entire refinement process was rather smooth, and the 3 points of bliss that were consumed were within expectations. 1 point, 3 points, 10 points, and 30 points. These were the 4 nodes of the Great Sin's cumulative effect. The fruit of the Great Sins reduced the 10 points to 7 points and was further strengthened by the kettle's function. The lower limit of the refined magic fairy was extremely high. As the light faded, Dake quietly waited for the internal refinement of the magic card to be completed. At the same time, he began to think about the next basic refinement method. He planned to do the next basic refinement tomorrow morning. A few minutes passed in the blink of an eye. As a large amount of impurities were expelled, the internal refinement of the magic card finally stopped. Dake picked up a mercury knife and skillfully cut open the light cocoon that enveloped the magic card. An unusually strong aura of death then leaked out from within. Dark abruptly focused and discovered that the underworld fire in his palm had actually become restless. Is it a magic fairy with the same attribute? He released the underworld fire and looked at the dancing gray flame. His gaze gradually became serious. He then clenched his fist and put the underworld fire back into his palm. He then picked up the magic card and started again. When the stains on the card were washed clean, the edge of the magic card emitted a faint golden halo. A gold card with 4 surekill skills. He was mentally prepared for the underworld fire's abnormal behavior, so he wasn't too surprised at the moment. Located in the middle of the card was a coffin-like magical elf that was obviously an undying species. The coffin was made of pink and gray. It had blood-red eyes and a small gray mask inlaid between its eyebrows. Its teeth were like saw teeth. For hands stretched out from the slit of the coffin. They were like shadows that could be stretched and twisted at will. They were dark blue in color. It was a shining death coffin. The death coffin was the final evolved form of the crying mask. It was a coffin Pokemon with the mummy characteristic. In the original setting, the death coffin could devour humans or Pokemon that approached it and turn them into mummies. However, most of the time, it would mistake itself for a real coffin and lie quietly in a temple, ruins, or graveyard in a deep sleep. The death coffin liked to eat gold nuggets. Therefore, if a death coffin was found in a temple, ruins, or graveyard without being mummified, it was very likely that one would obtain a whole box of gold treasures. The soul orb obtained after killing the dark mummy was finally refined into a coffin that could be used to make mummies. This makes sense. It's not random at all. Dake complained slightly. He then calmed down and infused his magic to investigate. Card name, Death Coffin. Type, Sprite card. Level, Race, Undying. Attribute, Spectre. Magic power, 2400. Attack, 1200. Defense, 3000. Surekill skills, Mummy Seal, Iron Wall, Hidden Spirit, Ambush. I finally refined a normal 6-star Magic Guide sprite. Looking at the 6-star Magic Guide sprite card in his hand, Dake's worries disappeared. The high defense obtained at the expense of attack power is enough for it to be useful in a 6-star environment. 2400 magic power isn't low. After all, it's not a Magic Guide sprite refined from the fruit of great sin. I can't ask for too much. Dake's expression changed slightly as he looked at the Surekill skills. A good combination of 3 measurements was only the foundation. A powerful Surekill skill was the soul of a Magic Guide sprite. Mummy Seal, Iron Wall. First of all, the mummy. Did it transform from the characteristics of the death coffin? With this thought, Dake infused his magic to investigate. Mummy. After capturing the target, it will temporarily become a mummy. Its race will become an undying species, and its attribute will become a specter. Its movement speed will be greatly reduced, and its own characteristics will disappear. Other Surekill skills that are not of the Spectre attribute will not be able to be used. This is passive to active. Can this death coffin really turn people into mummies? Dake's heart skipped a beat. He originally thought that this coffin would be a perfect match for Vampire's Daughter. How could a vampire not have her own coffin? He never thought that the death coffin could really turn people into mummies. However, the Surekill skill Mummy should be a strong single-target control spell similar to Pig Transformation or Sheep Transformation. The information of the Surekill skill, Mummy, was already very detailed. It could turn the target into a mummy for about 30 seconds, but it would change according to the strength of the target. The specific effects could only be known after testing it. The biggest flaw was that it could only be triggered after capturing the target. It needed to be unexpected. The death coffin's speed was extremely slow, only slightly faster than Kettle Kettle. Anyway, let's take a look at the next Surekill skill. Seal. Dake couldn't help but focus. He had an instinctive feeling that this seal might be an extremely crucial Surekill skill. Seal. The death coffin can trap the target in its own coffin and completely seal it. Unless the target's magic or attack power or skill power is higher than the death coffin's defense, it will not be able to break free. The sealed target's soul will be gradually digested by the death coffin and turned into its own magic. It's indeed completely different from the original. Dake thought carefully. In Pokemon, Seal was a Surekill superpower skill that could seal the opponent's same move. However, the seal of his death coffin was a Surekill skill of the Spectre attribute. The death coffin could seal the target in its body and devour the target's soul and turn it into its own magic. Moreover, its 3,000 points of defense would be extremely difficult to break through against the first and second tier magic elves. Wait a minute, the magic converted from the seal, is it like the Fear Gem and Moon God Mirror? Magic reserve, or is it the death coffin's own magic, upper limit? Dake suddenly thought of this question, and his eyes flashed. In theory, magic cards can't grow, but since there's the moon god's soul as a precedent, it might not be so. There's no rush. He couldn't wait to look at the next surekill skill. Iron Wall. Iron Wall was a very common surekill skill. The difference between it and round transformation and hard transformation was that it increased the base defense by twice as much as round transformation and hard transformation. Iron Wall hardens the skin like iron, greatly increasing the user's defense. The increase is 100% of the base defense. Since the Honey Dragon had the same surekill skill, Dake understood it with just a glance. The Death Coffin's base attack was as high as 3,000 points, and a 100% increase would be 6,000 points. This was basically a point that normal attacks couldn't break through. However, Iron Wall could only last for 60 seconds, and it could barely last for 2 rounds. However, the Death Coffin didn't have the ability to attack, and it couldn't just defend. Dake suddenly recalled the effect of the seal. And he suddenly understood. I see, Seal and Iron Wall are a combination skill with a combo effect. Let's not talk about the Seal's additional soul-devouring effect for now, just the operation of trapping the target in the coffin. If Iron Wall is activated at the same time, the threshold of breaking the seal will increase from 3,000 to 6,000 points, and it can trap the target for 60 seconds. If I think about it this way, 60 seconds suddenly becomes very long. Then there's the last surekill skill. Hidden Spirit Ambush. Hidden Spirit Ambush was an extremely powerful surekill skill of the ghost element. Hidden Spirit Ambush. When the Death Coffin activates the Hidden Spirit Ambush, it can sneak into an alternate dimension and enter the shadow ambush state. Under normal circumstances, any attacks from the opponent will not affect the Death Coffin in the shadow ambush state. The Death Coffin cannot enter the shadow ambush state while carrying a sealed artifact. After a maximum of 30 seconds, the Death Coffin will emerge from the alternate dimension and launch a fatal attack on the target. Even if the target is in a protective state, it can still hit. Due to the Death Coffin's extremely low base attack, the Hidden Spirit Ambush's power might not be ideal. However, its surekill skill was very valuable. The shadow ambush state could last up to 30 seconds, and it could launch a surprise attack that ignored protection, allowing the Death Coffin to easily appear behind the target. The only thing that prevented it from sealing the target into its body was probably the size of the coffin. Let's see how big it is. With this thought in mind, Dake summoned the Trash Slime to his side and activated Greed 3. Then he used the Greed Slime 2's split body as a sacrifice to summon the Death Coffin. As the sacrificial summoning ended, a pink coffin emerged from the summoning array. What a pity! Although the Death Coffin also has the word God in its name, the coffin is its main body. Dake looked at the Death Coffin that appeared for the first time and couldn't help but raise his head to size it up. The size of this Death Coffin was much larger than he had expected. The standard height of the Death Coffin was 1.7 meters, but the Death Coffin that he had refined was 2.5 meters tall. It stood there like a super door. Is this a flash mutated individual? In a battle system that used Seal as the core, the bigger the Death Coffin was, the better. Dake was pleasantly surprised. He couldn't help but touch the outer skin of the Death Coffin. It was cold to the touch. Then, a gust of energy suddenly seeped into his fingertip. The Underworld's fire in his hand suddenly ignited. A moment later, Dake held the Underworld's fire and carefully sensed the aura of the Death Coffin. He discovered that the aura of the two was highly similar. He rubbed his chin and immediately took out a Bliss 3. He was going to activate the Death Coffin's spiritual intelligence first, and then think about how to deal with it. In the name of Dake Dimming, I summon Bliss 3. The Death Coffin, which had a pink glow as its main color, was inexplicably compatible with the light of Bliss. Dake was just thinking that the Death Coffin wasn't in human form, so he didn't have to worry about it becoming difficult to deal with under the influence of Bliss 3. He saw that the Death Coffin's opened eyes were filled with joy. Not good. Dake knew that things weren't good. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was grabbed by 4 dark blue shadowy hands and stuffed into the Death Coffin. Bang! The coffin lid closed. Dake's vision was pitch black. However, he didn't have any sense of danger, and casually pushed the coffin lid open. As the light shone into the interior, he could clearly see what the death coffin looked like. It wasn't as pale and gloomy as he had imagined, but a light pink like a young girl's. After walking out of the coffin, Dake stood in front of the death coffin again. He then waved the underworld fire in his hand at it and asked, "How was it?" "Death heartsuit." The death coffin immediately let out a cute cry. Then, it suddenly reached out a shadowy hand and grabbed the underworld fire in its palm and stuffed it back into the coffin. Its two eyes immediately formed a pair of crescent moons. Dake pondered and said, "Do you like it a lot?" Dake. The death coffin immediately responded with an excited cry. Then, it seemed to realize that it had received permission, and a faint black light appeared on the surface of its body. Dake could clearly feel that the underworld fire's aura was weakening bit by bit, but the rate of weakening was very slow. It seemed that the death coffin wasn't eating at a fast rate. He picked up the magic card and found that the death coffin's magic power limit was increasing bit by bit. However, the increase wasn't large. It was basically a rate of 1 point every few minutes. In an entire hour, it would probably only increase by about 10 points, and this was because it was absorbing the underworld fire. As expected, it's not that simple, Dake estimated. At this rate, it'll only increase the magic power limit by about 1,000 points in 100 hours. I wonder if this underworld fire is enough? Will the effects decrease if it absorbs too much? 15 minutes later, the death coffin returned to normal, but it still clung to Dake. Wherever Dake went, it followed. It was as if he was carrying a huge coffin behind him at all times, and this coffin was a pink coffin of pain. If it wasn't for the sealed artifact in its body, it might have stuffed a blanket into the coffin and turned itself into Dake's exclusive bed. Dake actually quite enjoyed the clinginess of the Bliss' magic elves. He introduced the death coffin to the magic elves in the dormitory and found that little dream demon, and the scabbard quickly became one with it. It could be said that they brought it into this big family. After that, Dake quickly tidied up the remnants of the experiment, washed up, cultivated, and went to sleep. Friday morning, Dake woke up the magician's secretary and ordered it to summon a few magic elves that weren't recorded in paradise. Then he began his very regular daily routine. It wasn't until 8 o'clock that he put down his book and prepared to do the second experiment. However, before the experiment, he first summoned the death coffin in front of him. As soon as the death coffin was summoned, it immediately sucked in the underworld fire. The underworld fire that had been devoured last night already showed signs of instinctive avoidance. However, it didn't have a true consciousness, so it was impossible for it to escape the death coffin's hands. The death coffin sucked on the underworld fire, as if it was sucking on a lollipop, and it exuded a pleasant aura. According to the working hours of 16 hours a day, its upper limit of magic could increase by 160 points in a day. However, Dake could clearly feel that the underworld fire was gradually weakening. It could be seen that this absorption method that could increase the upper limit of magic was extremely damaging to the underworld fire. Maybe it won't last a day? Dake frowned and weighed the pros and cons before instructing, "Remember to keep the fire seed." Dake. The death coffin bent down and nodded, and 4 shadow hands came over to hug it again. Dake hurriedly stopped them. This kind of loss to the underworld fire could not be recovered. The reason Dake kept the fire seed was to protect his identity as the holder of the underworld fire, so that he could observe and sense the underworld fire. However, after the duel in the afternoon ended, he would immediately head to Traveler's Street and let Eve use the consonant spell to communicate with the Duke's mansion and inform Claire and Yvette of his disappearance. Because now he could basically confirm that the death coffin could completely destroy the underworld fire. Moreover, if he wanted to continuously increase the upper limit of magic of the death coffin, he would need an endless supply of underworld fire as food. If one underworld fire could provide 100 points of upper limit of magic, then absorbing more than 100 underworld fire would increase his upper limit of magic by 10,000 points. A 6-star magic guide elf with 10,000 points of upper limit of magic. Would you be afraid? Apart from that, he also wanted to do a separation experiment to see if the death coffin could separate the underworld fire from the human body through the seal method. If it could only separate the underworld fire and leave the power given by the underworld fire behind, then this experiment could be considered a complete success. Dake repeatedly deduced in his heart, and the more he thought about it, the more he felt that this plan was feasible. He urgently needed the Duke's mansion to send someone to cooperate with the experiment. If the experiment was successful, then the hidden danger of the underworld fire could be completely eradicated. This was very significant. At 8:30, Dake finished the rest of the preparations. He poured the 7 points of bliss that he had prepared into the insect branch and picked up the fox grass. But as he carried the fox grass to the balcony, he suddenly noticed the large amount of dragon-type materials that he had traded with Senior Panduola. His heart suddenly moved, and he put the fox grass back. The fox grass intimately rubbed against his trousers. Dake squatted down and hugged it, muttering, "Perhaps adding some precious dragon-type materials can further increase the probability of obtaining a higher-grade magic guide elf?" The soul pearl, obtained from killing the King of Spectres, was of extremely high quality and could only be obtained by chance. From the moment Dake obtained this soul pearl, he wanted to use it as the core to refine a third-tier magic guide elf. Among his magic guide elves, only the daughter of the vampire was a third-tier magic guide elf. However, the daughter of the vampire was not a product of conventional refinement. He wanted to achieve a breakthrough and rely on himself to refine the first third-tier magic guide elf card. The soul pearl in his hand was an opportunity. However, even the young cyanide dragon that he had refined with a white dragon pearl and a high-quality dragon's reverse scale as the core materials was only a 6-star third-tier magic guide. Could he really refine a third-tier magic guide elf with just this soul pearl? Dake reorganized his thoughts and walked in front of the shelf that was filled with dragon-type materials. Compared to that soul pearl, he actually had a higher-grade ghost snake magic crystal in his hand. However, that magic crystal was too special and seemed to be the core material used to refine the ghost snake. The soul pearl that the King of Spectres dropped was even purer and more suitable as a refining material. What if I don't use this soul pearl as the core material and use it as a secondary core? Dake couldn't help but ponder. When I refined the single scabbard, I already understood the way to lower the secondary core. Of course, if the main core material is much higher in grade than the soul pearl doesn't need to be lowered at all. It will automatically become a secondary core. What if I use the soul pearl as the secondary material and change the main core to the dark attribute material that is most compatible with the spirit attribute and bliss? The black dragon tooth? The black dragon tooth had both the dark attribute and the dragon attribute. There were 2 of them. Among the materials that he had obtained from the trade with Panduola, there were also 9 black dragon scales as a bonus. With the black dragon tooth as the core material, the soul pearl as the secondary core, the black dragon scales as the supplementary material, and the bliss fruit dragon. If I still can't refine a third-tier magic guide elf, then I can only say that it's finally time for me to repay my debt. Dake made a prompt decision, and then let the little devil beast evolve into a devil beast, and used instant teleportation to bring the dragon grass back from the club's classroom. Dake used a towel to wipe off the remaining liquid on the dragon grass, and then carried it to the insect tree to feed it bliss, dragon, darkness, and spirit. The Doraemon family in Pokemon, the legendary ghost dragon Ratina, the underworld dragon, condemnation deity in Yu-Gi-Oh!, and the zombie Tyrannosaurus in Digimon? Ratina doesn't seem likely, but the others are all possible. Dake took a deep breath and watched as the dragon grass head gradually grew a bud, and finally blossomed and bore fruit. He carefully plucked the fruit and gave it to Kettle to be freshly squeezed. Then he cut the bliss fruit stem and prepared to keep it as a supplementary material in the future. When Kettle turned the bliss fruit into bliss fruit juice, he bottled it and began experimenting. The refinement method is dragon species spirit type. The core material is Black Dragon Tooth. The secondary core is Soul Orb. The supplementary materials are Bliss Fruit Juice and Black Dragon Scale. The base material is Soul Remnant of the Spirit Sucker. Soul Remnant was a better base material than Spirit Honey and Brain Page Essence. In order to ensure that this refinement was a success, Dake gave it everything he had. The entire process of the experiment was needless to say. After activating the number 1 refining formation, he put in 3 pieces of Black Dragon Scales and other supplementary materials, then put in the secondary core Soul Bead, the main core Black Dragon Tooth, and finally dripped the Bliss Juice Dragon. During the entire refinement process, he purposely slowed down and tried his best not to make any mistakes. It took him a whole hour to complete all the steps. After he poured all of the Bliss Juice Dragon into the number 1 refining formation, the light instantly shone brightly. Then it suddenly shrunk to the surface of the magic card and began the final self-smelting process. Dark's mind relaxed as exhaustion hit him. The emptiness from the depletion of magic power spread all over his body. He took the apple juice from Ivan the Fairy and drank it all in one gulp, and finally recovered. This Black Dragon Tooth is surprisingly difficult to refine. To refine a 3rd-tier magic fairy, he had to be fully prepared. This time, he had been too impatient and had forgotten to prepare a magic recovery item. If not for the rapid growth of his magic, he was afraid that he would have run out of magic in the process of refining the Black Dragon Tooth, and the experiment would have failed. Thank goodness, thank goodness. After he had calmed down, Dake focused his attention on the magic card on the experiment table and watched it slowly react. Whether it was the choice of materials or the refinement experiment, he had done his best. If it still failed, then he could only accept it. Therefore, he was still quite relaxed now. The reaction speed of the magic card was extremely slow. Time passed by little by little. It was not until about 10 minutes later that the internal reaction completely stopped. During this time, Dake had already cleaned up the impurities discharged from the magic card more than once. Even so, the experiment table was still covered with sticky black gelatinous matter. At this time, I can't be anxious. Dake first cleaned up all the rubbish on the table, then picked up the magic card full of stains and put it under the tap to rinse. If he could, he even wanted to take a shower and change his clothes, put his palms together and pray, and do a full set before opening the card. Unfortunately, there were too many magic fairies watching in the dormitory, and he really could not lose face. In short, he tried his best to calmly remove all the stains on the surface of the magic card, and after rinsing it, he finally got his hands on this brand new magic fairy card. The first thing he saw was the star level. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 stars, great. Only then did Dake finally relax, and his heart was indescribably excited. Although according to his expectations, if the materials this time were used for directional refining, it would not be too much to refine an 8-star magic fairy card. However, 7-star was better than 6-star. After all, it was still considered the 3rd tier. As the first time he broke through 0, he could not ask for more. Greed +1 failed. Dake raised his hand and looked at the entire card surface. Level is 7-star, race is a dragon type, attribute is dragon type plus ghost type, card name, Multi-Dragon Baluto. Multi-Dragon Baluto was the final evolved form of the Multi-Dragon family. Multi-Dragon Messiah, Multi-Dragon Chi, Multi-Dragon Baluto. As it was a new Pokemon that came out later, Dake's understanding of the Multi-Dragon family was only limited to pictures. The Multi-Dragon family's image design was really a clear stream among the increasingly strange Pokemon. He had a good impression of the Multi-Dragon Baluto, and now that he saw that he had actually refined it, he could not help but feel happy. The Multi-Dragon family was basically a dragon type that was designed with arrows as the blueprint, and the Multi-Dragon Baluto was no exception. Its head was a flat triangle, and there were 4 launcher-like holes on the horns that extended to the sides. There was a Multi-Dragon Messiah, resting in each of the 2 inner holes. As an invisible Pokemon, the Multi-Dragon Baluto had its own invisibility ability. The end of its tail gradually became transparent, like a ghost floating in the air. Dake carefully observed the card surface, and suddenly realized something, and immediately injected magic to check it out. After a while, the joy on his face grew stronger. Sure enough, this is an army-type magic fairy card. The so-called army-type magic fairy card referred to the existence of multiple magic fairies in a magic fairy card. This type of magic fairy card was usually very rare. Dake had a deeper impression of Senior Angelia's fairy choir, Deanna's Bear's Den, and Joseph Bruno, who won the Easter Duel Festival at the same time as him, received a prize on the podium. 9 Little Pigs. Of course, the name of the magic fairy card should not be 9 Little Pigs. Joseph Bruno was now a first-year astronomy professor, and every Wednesday he would pass by the door of the Magical Zoology Society. The Multi-Dragon Bolito magic fairy card in Dake's hand was made up of a Multi-Dragon Bolito and 2 Multi-Dragon Messiah. According to the settings, when the battle begins, the Multi-Dragon Bolito would use the speed of sound to launch the Multi-Dragon Messiah that lived in the holes on its horns. This ultimate skill was called Dragon Arrow, and it was the exclusive ultimate skill of the Multi-Dragon Bolito. In addition, the 2 Multi-Dragon Messiah were undoubtedly independent individuals with their own consciousness. Therefore, after Dake confirmed that it was an army-type magic fairy card, he could not help but have a conjecture in his mind. Could these 2 Multi-Dragon Messiah be evolved using Great Sin card? Once this idea came out, it naturally could not be stopped. He was full of anticipation, and could not wait to infuse his magic power to check the specific data of the Multi-Dragon Messiah magic fairy card. Card name, Multi-Dragon Bolito. Type, fairy card. Level, for all. Race, dragon. Attribute, dragon/specter. Magic power, 3000. Attack, 3800. Defense, 2700. Ultimate skill, Dragon Arrow. Penetration. Dragon's Dance. Meteor Swarm. Multi-Dragon Messiah was a very standard strong attack type magic fairy. It had more than 300 points of attack power over the 7-star pinnacle, making it stand out among the 7-star magic fairy cards. Moreover, Multi-Dragon Bolito had a hidden attribute. Its speed was very fast. High attack, high speed, and invisibility. It was a natural assassin. As for its sure kill skill, it further strengthened its attack power. Dake first looked at Multi-Dragon Bolito as exclusive ultimate skill, Dragon Arrow. Dragon Arrow. There are 2 Multi-Dragon Messiah in the shooting hole of the Multi-Dragon Bolito's corner. Those are its arrows. The Multi-Dragon Bolito can shoot the Multi-Dragon Messiah as arrows separately or at the same time. The power of the Dragon Arrow depends on the combination of the 2 attacks. Only after the Multi-Dragon Messiah returns to the shooting hole can the Multi-Dragon Bolito continue shooting the Dragon Arrow. This ultimate skill was the absolute core of the Multi-Dragon Bolito. Along with the information of the Dragon Arrow, the data of the Multi-Dragon Messiah also flowed into his mind. Card name, Multi-Dragon Messiah. Type, fairy card. Level, race, dragon. Attribute, dragon/specter. Magic power, 800. Attack, 1000. Defense, 500. Ultimate skill, penetration. Lightning flash. Hold. Even the Multi-Dragon Messiah as an arrow was an orange card with 3 ultimate skills, although these 3 ultimate skills were very subtle. High attack and low defense. It's actually not bad among the 2-star magical fairy. Together with the attack of the Multi-Dragon Bolito, it's 4800 points. If it can evolve a little lower, it can be used as a sacrifice. That would be very good. The first ultimate skill is the penetration that it has at the same time as the Multi-Dragon Bolito. Penetration. It can penetrate the target's barriers, substitutes, and other obstacles and directly attack the target. I see, both the Multi-Dragon Bolito and the Multi-Dragon Messiah have the penetration characteristic. Maybe it can even penetrate protection, armor, shields, and so on. This ultimate skill maximizes the power of the Dragon Arrow. Speaking of the Dragon Arrow, with the nature of the Dragon Arrow, the AoE attack buff might be able to double its benefits? Dake thought quickly and looked at the second ultimate skill of the Multi-Dragon Messiah. Lightning Flash. Lightning Flash greatly increases its speed and pounces on the target like lightning. 87 of 139, super long update. I'm too sleepy. I was tired the whole day yesterday, and only slept for 3 hours in the middle before I got up. It's the last 2 days. Brothers, please vote your monthly votes and blades. If you don't vote, it will be swallowed by the system. Recommend a book written by a friend at midnight. I helped set it up. Chapter 665. Speaking of lightning flash, it was necessary to mention the famous actor, Pika O.'s Golden Z-Shake. Dake thought for a bit, and realized the practicality of this killing move. First of all, lightning flash was a killing move that could greatly increase the speed. Increasing the attack power through the speed increase was a basic operation. Even when Doran Messiah was shot out as an arrow, it could use lightning flash to perform a second acceleration, adjust the direction, and instantly destroy the enemy. Secondly, after Doran Messiah was shot out, it could use lightning flash to quickly return to the firing port, reload, and shoot again. At this time, if it added its 3 killing moves hold, it could basically ensure that each Doran Messiah could be shot twice. Hold. Within 30 seconds after the successful release, even if Doran Messiah receives a fatal attack once, it can still retain the last drop of blood. If it is used continuously within an hour, the success rate of each use will be reduced to 1/3 of the previous one. From the information, Hold was the active version of Sturdy, and it could obtain a chance to avoid death. This allowed Doran Messiah to not be shot out as an arrow and die because of the reaction force when it hits the target. Remember, https://m, vipcanchu, VIP, penetration, lightning flash, and hold. These 3 killing moves are indeed in line with Doran Messiah's arrow positioning. Of course, it is also in line with the assassin's positioning. After a little analysis, Dake looked at the 3rd killing move of Doran Boruto, Dragon's Dance. Dragon's Dance. Fiercely perform a mysterious dance to increase the momentum and greatly increase the attack and speed. The higher the momentum, the more the increase in attack and speed. The highest increase is 50% of the basic attack and speed. This was obviously a killing move of the same type as Sword Dance, of the single scabbard. However, Sword Dance could increase the attack buff by at least 50% and at most 100%. Dragon's Dance could only increase the attack buff by up to 50%, but at the same time, it could also increase the speed. This was the biggest difference between Dragon's Dance and Sword Dance. High speed was the biggest advantage of Doran Messiah. Now that this advantage could be further magnified, it was even more terrifying. As for his last killing move, Meteor Swarm, Dragon Meteor Swarm, it provided him with an important means of spell damage. Meteor Swarm. Dragon Baruth summons meteors and causes them to fall like meteors, dealing devastating damage to the target location. After using it, the power of the spell will be greatly reduced due to the reaction force. Although Meteor Shower had the side effect of reducing the power of the spell, Boruto Duolong did not have any other spells other than Meteor Shower. In other words, it was equivalent to having no side effects. Needless to say, the power of the Meteor Swarm did not need to be mentioned. Its super long range and super large range also greatly increased its practicality. This way, Boruto Duo Dragon would have complete single target physical damage and area of effect magic damage. After Dake checked all the ultimate skills, he picked up the Boruto the Duo Dragon magic card and prepared to summon it. Whether this magic elf card was a god or a ghost, it would depend on the next test. Dake also relied on Greedy Slime 2 and its split body as a sacrifice to finally summon Boruto the Duo Dragon. The magic elf that was refined using the Fruit of Bliss had its own intelligence since birth. As soon as Boruto the Duo Dragon appeared, it looked around vividly. 2 Doran Messiah quietly drilled out from the launch ports on its horns and also timidly observed the world. Dake looked up and sized it up. Its body length of more than 3 meters made Boruto the Duo Dragon's body look surprisingly slender. However, if it was placed among the dragon species, it could only be considered a small dragon. Its tail was thick and long, occupying more than half of its body proportion. The remaining part was only about 1.5 meters. In short, it could only be considered as barely mountable. Duo Dragon Dake reached out his hand, and Boruto the Duo Dragon flew over lightly, its head lowered like a stealth fighter and rubbed in his palm. The two little Doran Messiah directly drilled out of the launch ports and floated over from both sides like ghosts. They circled around it and whispered softly. Their voices were full of affection. Such an independent individual, no matter how you looked at it, it did not look like an unconscious split body of Boruto the Duo Dragon. After Dake communicated with them for a while, he performed a short sacrificial summoning experiment on one of the Doran Messiah. The final result was satisfactory. This Doran Messiah could be used as a sacrifice. However, as they were the appendages of Boruto the Duo Dragon, when the summoning of Boruto the Duo Dragon was lifted, they would also return to the magic card. After Dake confirmed this step, he took a deep breath and began the most important part of the experiment. Doran Messiah. Evolution experiment. First, choose a Doran Messiah. Then summon Bliss 2 normally. Finally, summon Bliss 3 normally. The things that needed to be verified in this evolution experiment were completely confirmed when Bliss 2 came into play. Doran Messiah was shrouded in the brilliance of Bliss 2, and the Bliss emblem naturally appeared on top of its head. Although it did not evolve into a 3-star subspecies like Curse Cage, Subancient Beast, the Bliss emblem on top of its head already proved that it could absorb the power of Bliss. After using Bliss 3 in the experiment, Doran Messiah really evolved. The Doran Messiah that was used as an experimental subject quickly grew in the ambiguous pink brilliance. It actually evolved from a half-meter-long little dragon to a little fat dragon about 3 times the length. Compared to the slender Boruto the Duo Dragon, Doran Messiah was indeed a little short and fat. Dake looked at the Doran Messiah that was quite similar to Boruto the Duo Dragon, but there was no launch port on its horn. His eyes immediately focused on the Doran Messiah that was lying on top of its head. How did this Doran Messiah come about? A strange thought suddenly appeared in his mind. The word self-produced appeared in Dake's mind. Doran Messiah was a nanny Pokemon. It was said that if it did not let the Doran Messiah that it was taking care of ride on its head, it would not be able to calm down and would even try to put other Pokemon on its head. But unlike Boruto the Duo Dragon, Doran Messiah did not have a launch port and could not launch Doran Messiah as an arrow. It's a pity that there is no Bliss Ember, Dake said with some regret, then suddenly took out a Bliss 3 Moon and activated Bliss 3 Moon on the Doran Messiah, lying on top of Doran Messiah's head. Under the golden pink brilliance, this Doran Messiah actually evolved into a Doran Messiah, with Doran Messiah on top of its head. Dake's eyes twitched slightly, and he suddenly felt like he accidentally found a version bug. Although there was no Bliss 3, now if he only used Bliss 3, he could use it as a foundation to evolve multiple Doran Messiah and Doran Messiah. The only thing that limited him from forming a Doran army was the number of Bliss 3. However, Duolong-chi evolved from Duolong Messiah, from Duolong Boruto. According to the rule that Boruto the Duo Dragon's summoning would cause Doran Messiah to disappear if the Doran Messiah that evolved from the original Doran Messiah degenerated into Doran Messiah. Then the Doran Messiah and Doran Messiah that evolved from Doran Messiah would naturally disappear. In other words, they would share a 15-minute evolution duration. After 15 minutes, no matter how many Doran Messiah and Doran Messiah evolved, they would directly disappear. Moreover, no matter how they multiplied, they would not have intelligence. Although Boruto the Duo Dragon was an army-type elven card, it only had 3 intelligence and would not increase due to other reasons. Dake tried to look at Doran Messiah's data in depth. Card name, Doran Messiah. Type, elven card. Level, 4all. Race, dragon. Attribute, dragon/specter. Magic, 2000 attack, 2600 defense, 1500 killer skills. Dragon's Wave, Hidden Spirit Ambush, Hold Chain Attack. There's no Dragon Arrow. Dragon Arrow was the exclusive killer skill of Boruto the Duo Dragon. Even Doran Messiah did not have it. But instead, it had a dragon's killer skill called Dragon's Wave. Dragon's Wave. Doran Messiah spits out a dragon-shaped shockwave from its mouth, causing damage to the target. Although Dragon's Wave was not weak, it was not outstanding. And its second killer skill was the Spectre's killer skill, Hidden Spirit Ambush. Hidden Spirit Ambush. Doran Messiah can enter Shadow Ambush state with Hidden Spirit Ambush. Hidden Spirit Ambush was slightly more powerful than Dragon's Wave. The 30 seconds of Shadow Ambush state allowed it to avoid most dangers, and the additional effect of being able to enter Shadow Ambush state with Doran Messiah was very important. At the same time, Doran Messiah also had a killer skill, Hold. Hold. For 30 seconds, enter a defensive state, completely blocking the opponent's attack, and not being affected by most of the killer skills. If used continuously within an hour, the success rate of each use will be reduced to 1/3 of the previous one. Doran Messiah's 3 attributes were obviously more aggressive, but its accompanying skills were surprisingly functional. Dake couldn't help but look at the last killer skill, Chain Attack. His eyes were filled with surprise. Chain Attack. Dragon Doran Messiah attacks the target with the sound of a dragon's roar and causes damage. When there are more than one dragon in the group using Chain Attack, the first dragon that uses Chain Attack ignores speed, and the rest of the magic elves will immediately use Chain Attack, and the damage will be doubled. I've finally met a magic elven with the killer skill Chain Attack. Chain Attack only had 60 points of power in the Pokemon game, but if there were companions using Chain Attack at the same time, not only would it be instantaneous, but its power would also be doubled, from the originally unremarkable 60 points to 120 points. After that, when each companion used Chain Attack, its power would be 120 points. 120 points of power was equivalent to the Grass ultimate skill, Sunlight Blaze. However, the Chain Attack in front of him seemed to be a special dragon version. He wondered if he could use this as a basis to deduce the normal version of killer skill, Chain Attack? As Dake was thinking, he couldn't help but think of himself summoning hundreds of Doran Messiah and using Chain Attack at the same time to attack the enemy. He couldn't help but shiver and wake up from his fantasy. After facing reality, Dake took out another, Bliss 3, Moon, and evolved this Doran Messiah into a new Doran Messiah. Then he sat down in front of the experiment table and waited patiently as he recorded the data. 10 minutes later, when the first Doran Messiah's evolution time was up, the Doran Messiah and Doran Messiah that were evolved gradually disappeared. If I calculate it this way, if I purely rely on the Bliss card to stack the numbers, assuming there are countless Bliss 3 cards, evolving a Doran Messiah requires 3 seconds to cast and 3 seconds to cool down, a total of 6 seconds. Rough calculation, 10 in 1 minute, 150 in 15 minutes. 150, Doran Messiah, releasing Chain Attack at the same time. It's still not enough. Maybe I'll have to wait until the future when I can evolve the Magic Guide elves with just soul power. Then I'll be able to quickly build thousands of Doran Messiah. Dake patted the Magic Guide card and looked forward to it. After that, he introduced the Doran Baluto to the Enchanted Elves and entrusted them with the basic education of the Doran Baluto and the Doran Messiah. Then he sent the Draconic Dragon Grass back to the club's classroom. Then he calmed down and summarized and reflected on the 2 experiments. From every basic refinement experiment, he was able to figure out some of the secrets of directional refinement. Over time, he would naturally be able to master it. At noon, Dake Dimming went to the cafeteria alone to have a simple meal. After that, he recalled the Magic Guide elves one by one, and carefully adjusted the cards before stepping into the open-air arena. On Friday afternoon, the students who had been busy for a week finally had some free time. The news of Dake Diming's upcoming duel with a 5th-year student that had received a lot of attention was suddenly revived after a period of silence. It was like a gust of wind that blew through the entire castle. Students of all grades walked towards the open-air arena in groups of 3 to 5. Last weekend, the scene of Dake Dimming defeating Patricia Balling, a 4th-year student from the Magic Guide Academy, was still vivid in their minds. This week, he had even accepted a challenge from a 5th-year student. What would the result be? The students whispered to each other and fought to discuss. It was very lively for a moment. Not long after, the higher-ups of the various large clubs also entered the ring and sat down to wait patiently. With the opening of the Golden Cup, Dake Diming's dual strength was increasing at a speed visible to the naked eye. If he could still defeat that fifth-year student this time, then the House of Nobles would have a terrifying trump card that could surpass 3 grades in a row. If the other 3 academies still wanted to win this year's school championship, they would need more than just hard work. Therefore, among the students who came to watch the duel, many of them had abnormally solemn expressions. In such an atmosphere, the president of the Aristocratic History Research Society, Edwin Clarissa, suddenly asked Mike Owen, who was beside him, "Speaking of which, who is Vern Morse?" Mike Owen was speechless. Dake Diming's opponent today was Vern Morse, a fifth-year student of the House of Fools. In Mike Owen's perception, Vern Morse was not a stranger in the corner. In fact, a few years ago, Vern Morse had been quite active as a first-year student of the House of Fools, but the extent of his activity had not reached the point of being overly eye-catching. Therefore, it was not surprising that someone like Edwin Clarissa, who did not pay attention to outside matters, did not know much about him. However, after the start of this semester, Vern Morse's activity had increased even further, and he had become even more eye-catching. He was definitely not a weakling that could be taken lightly. Although Mike Owen was particularly optimistic about Dake Diming, he was still worried about today's duel. Slowly, the first year, second year, third year, more and more people who were familiar with Dake took their seats one after another. Panduola Doragon sat with the members of the literature club, which was a rare sight. She was softly conversing with the president of the literature club. Beside her were Winnie Scardy, Patricia Bolin, and the others. Obviously, they were all members of the literature club. In the School of Magic, where knowledge was power, it was normal for the members of the literature club to be the strongest in the school. As the pillars of the School of Magic, they had to face the sudden emergence of Dake Diming. In the area where the second-year aristocrats gathered, Deanna and Luosi were fully armed and ready to go at any time. They rushed to watch Dake's duel in the afternoon, and then prepared to enter the underground city again to work hard to become stronger. Being diligent might not always lead people, but if they were not diligent, it would be impossible to catch up with others. There were many second-year students who had the same idea as them. As the center of attention this time, Dake Diming had already entered the contestant lounge in advance. 1:30 in the afternoon. Vern Morse did not enter the contestant lounge, and Dake was reminded by the staff to enter the contestants' passageway and walk towards the arena. When he arrived at the bottom of the arena, he saw Vern Morse already walking towards the contestants' stage. His hair was a mix of 7 different colors, and it was very eye-catching. So it wasn't specially dyed for the masquerade party? Or maybe, it was not removed after it was dyed? No, could it be that it was dyed again for today's duel? Dake recalled this senior's outfit at the masquerade party, and could not help but want to ridicule him. At that time, this senior had suddenly appeared after he conquered a resource point. He was wearing a tuxedo, leather shoes, and the Prajna mask on his face had 2 red flowers drawn on it. Amidst the strangeness, there was a comical look that was hard to forget no matter what. And the magic fairy accompanying him was a ghost that was also wearing the same Prajna mask as him. The ghost mask was abnormally fierce, and there were 2 sharp horns on both sides of its head. Its hair was very lush. In addition, its body was completely covered in a large robe, and it revealed a sense of mystery and horror. It was because of the existence of the magic fairy that Dake had a higher opinion of Vern Morse's strength. He walked slowly to the red team stage, put the card deck into the card slot, and then activated the card table. He raised his head and looked at the opposite side. This was the first time he saw Vern Morse's face. Without the funny and strange Prajna mask, Vern Morse's appearance was actually not bad. Although his appearance could not be considered handsome, his facial features were clear and recognizable. Moreover, his skin was very fair, so much so that it did not seem out of place when paired with his 7-colored spiky hair. To be honest, his face was not hateful. If there was one thing that caused his reputation to gradually deteriorate, it would definitely be that mouth of his. "I didn't expect you to accept my challenge," Vern Morse said in a low voice as soon as the match started. Of course, because he turned on the loudspeaker. Low voice was only an adjective for his intonation. Dake could clearly see that he had been holding back for a long time. He had probably been thinking about this sentence since last week when he received the notification that he had passed the challenge. Now he finally had the chance to say it. It shouldn't be him, right? Looking at Vern Morse's low-profile appearance, Dake could not help but think. He originally thought that Vern Morse's sudden rise in power was most likely related to the Underworld Fire. Patricia Bullen also said that there was a third holder of the Underworld Fire, hidden in the academy. But now, it seemed that it was not the case. Therefore he clenched his right fist and let the Underworld Fire, which had shrunk a little, come out. He purposely leaked its aura. However, Vern Morse's expression did not change. Dake frowned in his heart and replied, "When I saw your name, I remembered that we met at the masquerade party, so I accepted the challenge." Vern Morse pursed his lips and smiled. "Then it seems that my image and temperament have shocked you." "Eh?" Dake curiously asked. "Is there any logic in this?" However, Vern Morse did not answer directly. Instead, he turned his eyes and said, "Since you dared to accept my challenge, then I recognize your courage." After he finished speaking, he even touched his colorful hair and looked like he was saying, "I am the best in the world." When Dake saw this scene, he suddenly had a bad feeling. Could it be that Vern Morse simply had a problem with his brain? Dake slightly sighed in his heart. He maintained the most basic courtesy and said, "Vern Morse Sr., let's start the duel." "Are you challenging me instead?" Vern Morse's mood was very high. He laughed on the spot and said, "Since I am already standing here, I naturally have no reason to reject your challenge. However, the next duel may not be as intense as you think, because it will be a slaughter show." The atmosphere was instantly tense. A cold wind blew between the contestants' stands. The audience outside the arena reacted violently because of this sentence. The entire arena was heated because of this. Since Dake Diming's performance had been very good, the majority of the audience had a positive impression of him. Vern Morse's small group of fans were almost instantly swallowed by the will of the crowd. The entire audience was filled with cheers for Dake Diming and boos for Vern Morse. Good, this is the feeling. However, Vern Morse was not worried. Instead, he was happy. There was a hint of madness in his slightly narrow eyes. Reversing the tide and stepping on the disobedient will is exactly what we seek. Are you ready? Second-year student, this is the last time you talk to me with a smile. Dake suddenly frowned. Beep. The referee saw that the atmosphere was good and immediately whistled. The contestants on both sides immediately focused. No matter what words were said before the duel, once the duel began, it was a pure contest of strength. Dake was not angry because of Vern Morse's words. He just felt that this person, maybe he really had a problem with his brain? Let the duel tell me the answer. Dake whispered softly and pressed his hand on top of the deck. Tick. After the words preparation stage, A30's countdown appeared. The contestants on both sides immediately drew their cards. As the 5 magic cards were drawn, Dake Diming lowered his head slightly and looked slightly serious. Baluto the Multi-Dragon, Magical Beast, Multiform, Bliss 3-month, Greed 3, Underworld Soul Ring. Dake was very sure that he had shuffled the cards. That was why he had drawn the Baluto the Multi-Dragon at the beginning. Although the Baluto the Multi-Dragon was called a bug, it was more of a bug in a real battle. In a real magic duel, its biggest drawback was that it could not be specially summoned. In Dake's deck system, a 7-star Magic Elf card was not that easy to summon. Because a 7-star Magic Elf card belonged to the 3rd tier, it needed at least one 2nd-tier Magic Elf card as a sacrifice. It was not good luck to draw the Baluto the Multi-Dragon in the first round. Of course, the good news was that he had also drawn the Magical Beast, Multiform. And it was a 3-star Magical Beast, Multiform. Although in reality, he had only put a 3-star Fantasy Beast, ever-changing monster into the deck. The Magical Beast, Multiform, could be said to be the savior of this battle. If it wasn't for ever-changing monster, this would have been a complete disaster. It was a level where it would not be too much to admit defeat on the spot. Dake picked out the Magical Beast, Multiform, from his hand in advance. This was his only choice at the beginning of the battle. As he did not need to think too much, he still had time to observe the opponent. He saw Vern Morse in high spirits. He had 3 cards in his left hand and 2 cards in his right hand. His eyes were bright. Tick. Battle Stage 1. 30s. The end of the preparation stage meant that the battle stage had officially begun. Both contestants did not hesitate to summon. In the name of Dake Dimming, I summoned the magical beast, Multiform. In the name of Vernmorse, I summoned the Devil's Face. It was the same ultimate summon. In just 3 seconds, the red and blue summoning areas lit up with the light of summoning. However, Vernmorse's magical sprite was obviously faster than Dake's. There was a slight gap between the two in terms of basic summoning. However, this gap was not impossible to make up for. Dake had confidence in the magical beast, Multiform. Just as he was thinking this, the Multiform suddenly raised its head when it appeared. Then its entire body squirmed. When it stopped, it already had the appearance of little Dake. Dake's eyes suddenly turned black, and 3 black lines slid down his forehead. Clap clap. The Multiform, who was wearing a black tuxedo, clapped its hands in the red summoning area and looked at the opposite side with a calm expression. After changing to a 3-star skin, it obviously became more confident, and its style of doing things changed a little. At this moment, the Devil's Face, that Vernmorse summoned, had already used its ultimate skill. The Devil's Face's appearance was a huge mask with a diameter of 2 meters. This mask emitted a dark red light. It had a sharp horn on its head, scarlet eyes, sharp fangs, and a ferocious appearance. Following Vernmorse's instructions, the moment the Devil's Face appeared, it opened its huge mouth and let out an extremely eerie howl. When the Multiform, in the red summoning area, heard this sound, it suddenly felt dizzy. The Devil's Face's eyes became more and more scarlet. It spat out pitch-black smoke from its mouth and spread toward the red summoning area at an extremely fast speed. Multiform, transform. At this moment, Dake ordered without hesitation. The Devil's Face was a very famous fiend. It was a particularly troublesome existence among the 3-star magical sprites. Card name, Devil's Face. Type, Sprite card. Level, *****. Race, Fiend. Attribute, Dark Poison Magic 1500. Attack, 500. Defense, 1500. Ultimate skill, Ghost Howl, Poison Smoke. Devil's Face, with the Ghost Howl controlling the target and the poison smoke spreading out, all the magical sprites that entered the summoning area would fall into the poison state and continue to lose HP. After that, it would transform itself into the Devil's Face and attach itself to the face of the magical sprite that appeared later on, so that it would not be affected by the poison smoke and obtain the overall magic power and defense bonus. If the Multiform did not transform at this time, it was afraid that it would immediately be poisoned. Hurry. The Multiform barely managed to stand up in the dizzy state and finally used its ultimate skill. Transform. The outline of its body suddenly wriggled, and when it became stable, it had already transformed into the Devil's Face. After the successful transformation, the Multiform was suddenly no longer affected by the poison smoke, and the dizziness slowly disappeared. Dake pressed down on the Bliss 3 Moon in his hand and patiently waited for Vernmorse's next move. Under normal circumstances, the Devil's Face would be the next powerful magical sprite that could equip the Devil's Face. The Multiform was forced to use Transform at the beginning of the game, and the next Transform would have to wait for 3 minutes, which was the beginning of the 7th turn. If Vernmorse decisively summoned the next magical sprite, Dake would have a hard time dealing with it. But looking at the cards in his hand, it was not impossible. Dake flicked his finger and switched the Bliss 3 Moon to the Underworld Soul Ring. And after this 3-second gap, Vernmorse, who usually had the cooldown of his summoning skills, began the next summoning. But it seemed that he saw that Dake's hand was not strong. So Vernmorse used the item card and summoned a pot in the blue summoning area. This pot was even bigger than the magic conducting ball. The surface of the pot was engraved with bloody patterns, and there were 2 demon horns on the sides of the pot. It's the Devil's Pot. Thick black smoke quickly covered the Devil's Pot, but Dake, dimming on the red team's platform, could already see the appearance of the Devil's Pot. With the Devil's Pot, Vernmorse could summon a second-tier devil without any cost. But the difficulty of refining the Devil's Pot was as high as the advanced fusion. Although Vern Morse was a fifth-year student, it was still surprising that he could refine the devil's pot. He seemed to have the capital to be arrogant. After summoning the devil's pot, Vern Morse could not control his smile. He looked at Dake, picked up the cards in his hand, and laughed softly. I have 3 magic conducting cards left, and these 3 cards are all 6-star magical sprites. Do you know what this means? Dake also laughed and said, It means that if you don't have the devil's pot, you will be stuck until you die. Vern Morse suddenly laughed. It's a pity that I'm not the one stuck. In the name of Vern Morse, I summon the Snuff Smoke Demon. The devil's pot, on the blue team's summoning area, felt the breath of the summoning, and it immediately spewed out billowing white smoke. The 6-star magical sprite, Snuff Smoke Demon, appeared out of thin air in the billowing white smoke. Dake narrowed his eyes and keenly noticed that the magic power stored in the devil's pot had been consumed by half. It could be seen that the devil's pot could not summon second-tier magical sprites without limit. 3 6-star fiends might be its limit. Card name, Snuff Smoke Demon. Type, Sprite card. Level, Race, Devil. Attribute, Dark. Magic power, 2500. Attack, 2700. Defense, 1400. Ultimate skill, Demon in Smoke. Smoke Ring Curse, Dark Shadow. The Snuff Smoke Demon, which had the ultimate skill Smoke Demon, could be born from the thick smoke even without the devil's pot. However, since Vern Morse chose to rely on the devil's pot, he might have to pay a special price to summon the devil's pot from the thick smoke. For example, most of the poisonous smoke would be sucked away. The Snuff Smoke Demon's body was almost condensed by billowing black smoke. Its upper body was extremely thick, and its lower body was reduced to a smoke ring. Its huge head was like a hornless bull's head, and its nose was huge. Snuff Smoke Demon. Dark Shadow. Despite Vern Morse's ostentatious appearance, he did not fall behind in commanding the magical sprite. The Snuff Smoke Demon expanded as soon as it appeared. Its entire body expanded from 2 meters tall to 5 or 6 meters tall, and its shadow grew even larger. Under the control of the power of darkness, it seemed to have developed a consciousness of its own, and it rushed toward the red half of the arena. The mask of the evil spirit beside it flew toward the Snuff Smoke Demon. The Snuff Smoke Demon stretched out its hand and wanted to put the mask of the evil spirit on its face. At this moment, a burning gray collar suddenly appeared on the mask of the evil spirit. Dake Dimming tapped the magic card lightly, and the Underworld Soul Ring was released. Although he did not have any sacrificial summons that could be used at the moment, just using the Underworld Soul Ring to capture the first-tier magical sprite was also a strategy. He pointed his finger, and the Underworld Soul Ring captured the mask of the evil spirit and quickly flew back to the red team. The Snuff Smoke Demon missed and instinctively chased after it. The Dark Shadow on the opposite side pounced from the poisonous smoke to the 100-face monster. However, the 100-face monster that had transformed into the mask of the evil spirit suddenly let out a howl. The ear-piercing scream resounded through the stadium again. The Snuff Smoke Demon that was hit directly felt a little dizzy. Then the 100-face monster spat out a thick poisonous smoke from its mouth, and even pushed the poisonous smoke in the red team to the blue team. Whoosh! A gust of cold wind came. The Dark Shadow suddenly emerged from the 100-face monster's feet. The shadow opened its huge mouth and swallowed the 100-face monster. The 100-face monster that transformed into the mask of the evil spirit was immediately entangled by the shadow. It was as if its whole body was wrapped in a skin membrane formed by black shadows. The traces of its struggle were visible to the naked eye. Dake flicked his fingertips, and the Bliss 3 moon's brilliance gathered into a pillar and shot straight down from the sky. The 100-face monster that was swallowed by the Dark Shadow suddenly exuded a dazzling brilliance. Its whole body expanded rapidly after the transformation was lifted. The spikes formed by the ordinary transformation pierced the Dark Shadow's curse with the power of Bliss 3 moon. When the brilliance of Bliss 3 moon completely disappeared, the 100-face monster had transformed into a 5-meter tall giant. This was not the ultimate skill transformation. but an ordinary transformation that only changed the appearance. But the 6-star fantastical beast, 100-face monster, had up to 2,500 points of magic power, attack and defense. Even if it was only an ordinary transformation, it was not inferior to the general 6-star magic guide elf. As the transformation intensified, the body outline of fantastical beast, 100-face monster, became clearer. It was a 5-meter-tall Dake Dimung. In the exclamation of the audience, fantastical beast, 100-face monster, stretched out its hand and grabbed the mask of the evil spirit that was bound by Underworld Soul Ring and covered its face. Even if it couldn't really equip it, Mask of the Evil Spirit could always filter poisonous smoke. And Snuff Smoke Demon was already deep in poisonous smoke. 90/139. I've been stuck for a long time today, and I finally finished writing. Thank you very much for your subscriptions, monthly votes, blades, and reward support. This month, there are only 16,000 words left from the small goal of 200,000 words per month. There are still 2 more updates, and it should be easily completed. Open a bounty for the first place on the monthly list. Monthly votes 333 chapters will end at 24 p.m. on November 30th. Existing monthly votes, 219,805. Chapter 669. The cheers of the audience outside the arena did not stop. However, there were already shouts coming from the ring. The staff immediately activated the emergency measures, causing 2 different scenes to appear from the inside and outside of the arena. As for Dake Dimung, facing the terrifying monster that was pouncing towards him like a giant snake, he only muttered, "Tyrant." The green-eyed tyrant whelp instantly flapped its wings and pounced towards the terrifying monster. The 2 sides came into contact in the middle of the arena. The green-eyed tyrant whelp was still in a berserk state. Even though it was unable to restrain its ruthless aura, it still retained the most basic rationality. However, the terrifying monster was not weak either. It was actually not torn in half by the green-eyed tyrant whelp. Roar! The furious roar of the green-eyed tyrant whelp resounded. An extremely deep claw mark appeared on the body of the terrifying monster, but it did not retreat at all. Instead, it forcefully endured the violent attacks of the green-eyed tyrant whelp and continued to pounce forward. After paying the price of losing half of its body, that monster actually succeeded in breaking through the obstruction of the green-eyed tyrant whelp. It roared as it pounced towards Dark Diamond. After that, it smashed its head against the outer barrier of the contestant stage. A faint sneer appeared at the corner of Dake's mouth. Remember in a second. https://m vip can't you? VIP. He raised his gaze slightly and looked into the eyes of the monster, savoring the despair within. The green-eyed tyrant whelp that turned around dragged it away and directly crushed it. In the blink of an eye, the staff members rushed onto the arena and fiercely suppressed Fern Morse, who was suffering from a splitting headache. The host, who appeared at the last minute, immediately used a voice that only the audience could hear to maintain order. The staff members who rushed onto the red arena asked about his safety and brought him down. After all, this was the School of Magic Engineering. The students' ability to accept things was extremely strong. The cries of surprise quickly disappeared and turned into scattered discussions. The audience outside the arena only saw the 2 contestants greeting each other. They preached the good atmosphere of competition second, friendship first, as they walked down the arena with smiles. Although it was slightly strange, it was more or less manageable. This disturbance quickly passed. The duel continued in an orderly manner. However, the contestants participating in the duel were distracted and were obviously not focused. At the same time, Dake was invited to the lounge. The head of the duel club, Inia Knight, hurried over. She stopped the moment she saw him and said calmly, "Hello, nice to meet you. I am the head of the duel club, Inia Knight." "Hello, I'm Dake Dimung from the Aristocrat House." Dake didn't seem to mind. He asked casually, "What about Fern Morse? How is he?" Inia Knight sat opposite him and said with a slightly serious expression, "He has been sent to the infirmary. We speculate that he should have been parasitized by some filthy thing." Okay. Dake nodded. Enia Knight asked, do you have any clue about Vern Morse? Dake smiled and said, I also want to have a clue. Enia Knight was slightly disappointed. Then we can only wait for the results of the professor's investigation. Who would have thought that something like this would happen at the end of November? You know what? If our judgment is correct and Fern Morse was parasitized by a monster, then there are two possibilities. Dake listened patiently. Enia Knight said, one is that he was parasitized at the beginning of the school term, and the other is that he was parasitized after he entered the school. Dark asked, like if we had breakfast this morning, or if we didn't. Enia Knight shrugged. That's what happened. There was no third possible alternative. Dake asked, then which possibility do you hope is better? Enia Knight shook her head and said, neither possibility is good because the monster has entered the school. You should prepare a little. If I'm not wrong, there may be a big investigation in the near future. She got up and said, I heard that this kind of thing is not rare in times of war, but I didn't expect to encounter it in times of peace. But with the professors present, everything will be fine. You can do whatever you want. If there is anything, we or the professors will use the branch card to inform you. Okay. Dake also got up and said, I still have a reservation today. The two of them walked out of the lounge one after the other, and then separated to the sides. As soon as Dake went out, he took out the secret passage's door card from his card bag. This thing had been vibrating for a while. He opened the card, and sure enough, it was a question from Panduola Sr. He replied, no problem. Then he was blocked by Deanna, Luosi, Doran, and the others. The second-year students of the aristocratic academy gathered around, chattering. Some of them were concerned about whether he was hurt, and some of them were curious about what had happened to Vern Morse. Dake said that he was fine, and showed the same confused expression. But he really did not know what happened to Fern Morse. The only possibility he could think of now was the underworld fire. But the manifestation of underworld fire was not like this, and he did not smell any trace of underworld fire. And according to Fern Morse's current state, he might have encountered something related to demons. This was somewhat similar to what happened to Luoboat Broheim last year. But the vampire Vlad in Luoboat's body was born from the secret passage, so where did the monster in Fern Morse's body come from? Now that the secret passage was half-sealed, the probability of something happening was not high. I'm also confused about this matter. My personal advice is to wait patiently for the professor's investigation results. Dake said a little louder to calm the aristocratic students, and then he continued. Anyway, it's not a big deal. Just in case, try not to go to remote places alone, especially not at night. I know that there are many people wandering outside after the curfew. As he spoke, someone complained, Ha Dake, your way of speaking is becoming more and more of a professor. Dark replied, that's because I'm a first-year arithmetic professor. That student was just casually saying this, but now that he was blocked, he couldn't help but laugh dryly. The student next to him poked his waist with a mischievous look. Then they gradually dispersed after walking out of the contestants' passage. And finally, only a few acquaintances were left. Dake looked at the big bag on Deanna's back and reminded her, You're still going to the dungeon, right? Oh yes. Deanna smacked her lips and suddenly did not want to go. Luosi said, We really have to go. Dake said, Don't worry, it's a small matter. There's also Doran and Pitten. I'm going to Traveler's Street, and I don't have much time. Haha, we're also very busy, Pitten said tactfully. Saying this, he pulled Doran up and immediately yo-yoed. Dake felt touched and said to Deanna and Luosi, Be careful when you enter the dungeon. If you encounter something you can't solve, learn how to activate the dungeon escape device. Okay, you're like a mother. Deanna immediately grabbed Luosi's wrist and ran away. Dake shook his head helplessly and turned to walk towards the Magical Animals Society. When he reached the Magical Animals Society, he released the magic guiding fairies one by one. Recalling his duel with Fern Morse, he realized that he did not have enough methods to summon high-star magic guiding fairies. If he only used sacrificial summoning to summon high-star magic guiding fairies, It would mean that he would have to sacrifice the time of low-star magic guiding fairies in his daily life to summon them. Even if it was not for the sake of the magic guiding duel, he still needed to use some ritual summoning methods. He pondered in the classroom for a while before he received a notification from Professor Shierfu. "They're here?" Looking at the letter in his school card, Dake returned the coquettish little anti-bird to Big Milk Can and left the classroom. Soon he arrived at the infirmary. School doctor, Sister Kalien, was busy in the room. Professor Shierfu and Professor Kazair were talking outside. Dake pushed the door open and asked, "What's the situation?" Professor Shierfu's face was as stiff as ever. However, Professor Kazair's face was obviously more serious. "Is it a big problem?" Dake asked as he found a stool and sat down. Professor Kazair nodded and said, "The initial diagnosis is that the implant was recently implanted, probably in late September or late October. If we make a reasonable guess, the other party might have acclimatized to the school for a while before taking action. Vern Morse might not be the only victim." Dake asked curiously, "So what exactly is that monster?" Only then did Professor Kazair relax and say, "Brain fluid demon, a special kind of demon that lives in the human brain. I thought that it had completely disappeared with the end of the war. I didn't expect to see it again in the school after so many years." Brain fluid demon? Dake couldn't help but wonder. Brain fluid demons were a species that was close to an elemental life form. They fed on the thoughts of the brain and excreted substances that would stimulate the nerves and make the host more emotional. However, it also had a stimulant effect that further stimulated magic power and physical strength. During the war, the demons would even implant brain fluid demons into the brains of some elites, making them fearless of pain and constantly excited and tireless. Brain fluid demons' own strength was also not to be underestimated. They could absorb the power of thoughts and continue to grow. When the host's emotions were abnormally agitated, the power of the brain fluid demon would temporarily skyrocket. If the host was seriously injured or mentally unstable, the brain fluid demon would devour the host and break out of its shell to become an even more terrifying monster. Although this kind of terrifying monster only existed for 24 hours, it still caused great losses to the human race. It was also because of this that the human race completely exterminated the brain fluid demons after the war, and even destroyed all the information on their creation. To be able to see a brain fluid demon after the war was even more shocking than seeing a vampire. Professor Kazair said, "Not only that brain fluid demon has obviously undergone a later stage of modification, making it less stimulating to the brain and more hidden. It has almost completely fused with the structure of the brain. Even if you can see through the brain, it would be difficult to detect. If it wasn't for Vern Morse's excessive emotional fluctuations that forced it to appear, it would have continued to lie dormant." Dake frowned slightly and asked, "Then how were they discovered during the war?" Professor Kazair said, "Through a type of mental wave. We can create a magic tool that can release mental waves. By adjusting the frequency of the waves to a certain point, it can stimulate the brain fluid demon and cause it to break out of its shell in advance. However, you know that this method can't be used in the school." "Break out of its shell?" Dake expressed his understanding. "Then isn't there a gentler method?" Professor Kazair shook his head and said with some regret, "I didn't really study the brain fluid demon during the war. Otherwise I might have been able to find out something. However, in the current situation, because the brain fluid demon's body has been destroyed by you, it's difficult to find out much from its roots in Vern Morse's brain. Therefore, I can't find a better method for the time being." Dake frowned slightly and asked, "Can't we start with the victim? I mean, get them to talk about it themselves?" Professor Kazair said, "We'll have to wait until Vern Morse wakes up to find out. After all, everything we're talking about now is just speculation. Perhaps he was already infected before he entered the school." However, just as he finished speaking, Sister Kalien had already walked out and said, "Kazair, Morse is awake. It seems that it's our turn." Professor Kazair smiled and looked slightly calm. Professor Shierfu said, "If Vern Morse was infected after he entered the school, we need to speed up. His exposure must have been an emergency. If the other party felt that he was bound to be exposed, Then they could do anything. Professor Kazair said. I'll do it as soon as possible. Then, all four of them entered the inner room. Vern Morse was lying on one of the beds. His face was paler than before, and his face was full of fatigue. The colorful spiky hair on his head was directly shaved off. Sister Ka Lien was merciless and shaved him until there was not a single strand of hair left. Vern Morse, on the other hand, looked more pleasing to the eye without his hair. Professor Kazair sat down beside him, while Dake and the other two stood beside him. Professor Kazair said gently, Do you know me? I'm a second-year professor, Kazair. Vern Morse opened his mouth and said weakly, Yes, Professor of Alchemy. Professor Kazair smiled slightly. Don't be nervous. You suddenly fainted on the stage. We've already sent you to the infirmary. Sister Ka Lien is there, so you'll be fine. Good morning. Failed to save the manuscript. Chapter 670. It seemed that Sister Ka Lien's prestige was deeply rooted in the hearts of the students. Vern Morse's face turned even uglier. Professor Kazair's eyes flashed as he activated the Eye of Truth and looked into Vern Morse's heart. Vern Morse's inner thoughts were revealed. He could not help but glance at Sister Ka Lien, who walked to the other side of the bed. He lowered his head and said gently, Sister Ka Lien's medical skills are trustworthy. Do you still remember fainting on the stage? Vern Morse looked around in confusion. Suddenly, he noticed Dake Dimming standing behind Professor Kazair. His face turned uglier. Seems like you still remember. Professor Kazair touched his nose and sighed. If it were not for Vern Morse's sudden appearance, he would have been playing games with his precious heart in the dungeon. However, the professors were still a deterrent. Vern Morse finally opened his mouth and said, I still remember. I lost. I actually lost. F***CK. If I didn't get the Demon King, how could I lose? Vern Morse's emotions suddenly became agitated, and he was about to lose control. Sister Ka Lien pointed at his neck, and he stopped in an instant. His emotions calmed down visibly. Website. https://m. VIP can't you? VIP. Professor Kazair nodded slightly and said, In the duel, winning and losing is normal. No one can always win and not lose. You just passed a threshold that you have to pass. Don't worry too much. Then his eyes were filled with disappointment. Vern Morse had no recollection of being parasitized by the brain fluid demon. He did not even see the brain fluid demon before he lost consciousness, due to the unbearable headache on the stage. If Vern Morse did not have any technology to block his brain or tamper with his memories, then he was obviously an innocent victim. Although this was in line with his guess, it was still disappointing. After all, if this was the case, things would become more troublesome. Professor Kazair thought for a moment and asked again, Have you ever felt that you couldn't control your emotions? Or that you had a sudden breakthrough in your magic power or stamina? Vern Morse was still cooperative, but when he was thinking, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his brain, and then his vision turned black, and he fainted again. However, Professor Kazair had already seen through his thoughts. On the night of September 28th? I remember it was Saturday. During the weekends, the students would have a wide range of activities. If they had entered the dungeon before, it would be difficult to trace their activities. Professor Kazair looked up at Sister Ka Lien and said helplessly, It seems that we won't be able to get anything from him for the time being. Think of a way to remove the brain fluid demon from his head. I mean, in a living state. Sister Ka Lien slightly furrowed her brows. After a long while she said, That's very difficult. You should know that even among the medical skills I've mastered, there are very few that involve the brain. There are many mysteries hidden in the human brain. If we're not careful, we can cause irreparable damage. Professor Kazair said directly, I'll go with you. Sister Carrion immediately felt relieved. That's fine. The professors were swift and decisive. Professor Kazair and Sister Ka Lien immediately began to prepare for the operation. Dake and Professor Shi Erfu went out together and stayed in the outer room. Dake thought for a moment and said, Professor Shi Erfu, if you can remove the brain fluid demon's remnant, I might be able to find more brain fluid demons, if there are more of them. Professor Shirfu smiled naturally and said, "One of the reasons why I asked you to come here. You were able to find so many treasure chests in the dungeon because of that, right?" Dake smiled and said, "Yes, after my slime was strengthened, it gained some searching ability. As long as I have it, I can try to find more." Professor Shirfu said, "I hope there won't be too many brain fluid demons." The more brain fluid demons there were, the more people would be infected. However, Dake shook his head and said, "I'm worried that we won't be able to find it." Professor Shirfu asked why. Dake said, "This incident happened in the duel hall. It must have spread throughout the entire academy. If someone really planted the brain fluid demon in Vernmorse's brain, they must have been alerted by now. If it were me, I would have destroyed the relevant items." Professor Shirfu frowned and said, "You're right. If this really happens, we can only use other methods." Dake asked curiously, "What methods?" Professor Shirfu said, "Let Kazair check them one by one." Dake couldn't help but say, "Won't it be too much work to check them one by one?" "Maybe," Sylph said in a low voice, non-committal. Dake thought for a moment and said, "If you're talking about using the mind-reading ability, I might be able to help." Professor Shirfu was stunned. He asked in confusion, "You've even learned Kazair's mind-reading ability?" Dake smiled and said, "My luck is not bad. I just recently refined a magic guide spirit that can see through people's minds. If you don't mind that the other one doesn't have intelligence, I can make 2 of them." "I see." Professor Shirfu nodded and said, "If you really need my help, I'll consider it." Dake smiled and said, "Just tell me when the time comes. How long will Vernmorse's surgery take?" Professor Shirfu thought for a moment and said, "Half an hour. In order to not leave any sequelae, it might take more time." "Half an hour? Less than I thought. Then I'll wait here," Dake said. Professor Shirfu asked curiously, "Is there anything else you need to do?" Dake shook his head and said, "It's nothing urgent. Let's focus on this." Although Professor Shirfu used magic to soundproof the room, the 2 of them still tried to keep their voices down when they talked. About 10 minutes later, a student suddenly came in for a consultation. Professor Shirfu casually dealt with it, which scared the hell out of the student. After a while, a sound finally came from the inner ward. Professor Kazair was the first to come out. Professor Shirfu hurriedly stood up and asked, "How is it?" Professor Kazair said confidently, "I replaced the gap left by the brain fluid demon with some absorbable substances. There won't be any adverse effects for the time being, but what happens next will depend on the absorption ability of his brain. If he can absorb those substances and heal himself, there won't be any sequelae." Professor Shirfu breathed a sigh of relief and immediately asked, "What about the brain fluid demon?" Professor Kazair smiled and said, "It has been completely extracted and is now stored in a jar. Do you want to take a look?" "Yes." Professor Shirfu immediately stood up and said, "We need to speed up." Professor Kazair nodded and said, "Indeed." Then he went back into the ward. Dake and Professor Shirfu immediately followed. In the ward, Vernmorse was lying quietly on the hospital bed. His complexion was much better than half an hour ago, and there was even a small apple on his cheek. But there was a very obvious scratch on his head. It was not a wound that was stitched up, but a mark that was drawn with a pen. Obviously, Professor Kazair and Sister Kalien used this scratch as a line to perform a craniotomy on Vernmorse. But with the treatment methods of this era, even if his head was cut into 8 pieces, as long as it was treated in time, it would still be intact. The problem was that the substance inside the brain was too delicate, and rough treatment methods could not be used. Sister Kalien was already a therapist at the forefront of this era, but she still needed the help of Professor Kazair to help her. For them, perhaps it was easier to cut the soul than to cut the brain. After all, things like the soul were not much after it was spread out. But when it came to the time to cut the soul, who would care about such a small problem? Dake turned his eyes to the jar that Professor Kazair mentioned. The jar was placed on the bed, about half a meter high. It seemed to be made of glass, but it should be made of a tougher material. The inside of the jar was filled with a viscous liquid, and a slightly white liquid substance was quietly floating in the jar. That should be the route left behind by the brain fluid demon. The route was about 20 centimeters long, and it was hard to imagine that it was taken out of a human body, but it was indeed so. Dake could not help but want to go forward and take a closer look. He was quite interested in this kind of thing that was rarely seen. But when Sister Kalien saw them enter the room, she had already picked up the jar and placed it on the table against the wall. Is this the brain fluid demon? Professor Shi-Erfu frowned. Professor Ka Zaire shook his head and said, It's just the root left behind. It took us a long time to separate it. Professor Shi-Erfu asked, Can you see anything? Professor Ka Zaire thought for a while and said, In fact, it should have been cultivated not long ago, at most 2 months. However, 2 months was exactly the time that Fern Morse had in mind. We can temporarily assume that he was implanted with the brain fluid demon on September 28th. Apart from that, we can only see that this brain fluid demon has indeed been cultivated very carefully. There aren't many people who can do this, even in the school. Even the professors can't do it? Professor Shi-Erfu asked. Professor Ka Zaire shook his head and said, Everyone has their own specialization. Then he said, Of course there are always people who can do it, if they know the cultivation method. Professor Shi-Erfu could not help but frown. This is a bit difficult. Although the information about the cultivation of the brain fluid demon has been destroyed, it doesn't mean that it is completely lost, and our library. Speaking of the Shungmalian Academy's library, Professor Ka Zaire could not help but reveal a bitter smile. There would always be strange books appearing in the library. Although he had benefited a lot from them, it would always bring trouble if this happened too often. Perhaps this was the result of someone accidentally obtaining the cultivation method of the brain fluid demon from the library, and further adjusting it. If the possibility of the underground city was added, then the scope of the search would instantly expand to the entire school. Professor Shi-Erfu took a deep breath and said, Dake, it's up to you now. No problem. Dake nodded and recalled the trash slime on the spot. He then used Greed 3 to evolve the trash slime into Greed 2. When the jelly-like giant slime appeared in front of everyone, Professor Shi-Erfu and Professor Ka Zaire did not look too surprised. Is it really it? Professor Shi-Erfu said in a low voice. Dake smiled and hugged the Greed 2 that took the initiative to come over. He said softly, The innate greed gave the Greed slime an endless desire. No matter what kind of treasure it is, as long as it wants it, it can obtain more. Professor Ka Zaire said with interest, So we have to make it want it first? Dake nodded and pointed at the brain fluid demon, remains in the jar. He said to the Greed slime too, I want to find more of this material. Can you take a look? The Greed slime too immediately jumped in joy. When Dake saw it squeezing out 2 tentacles and beating its chest, he turned around and said to Professor Ka Zaire, Professor, can you take the brain fluid demon, remains out of the jar for a while? Professor Ka Zaire frowned and said, That's it. Dake smiled and said, Yes. What I want is what it wants. But it needs to touch it before it can analyze the aura of the material it wants. At the same time, it needs to develop feelings. Professor Ka Zaire said, Wait a second, I need to do some processing. A few minutes later, Professor Ka Zaire inserted the brain fluid demon, remains into the Greed slime 2's body. The Greed slime 2 twisted its body and used its soft inner walls to wrap around the brain fluid demon remains. It greedily sucked its aura. After it memorized the aura of the brain fluid demon remains, it narrowed its eyes and tried its best to sense, hoping to find more brain fluid demon. Dake and the others waited patiently. After a while, the Greed slime 2 opened its eyes wide and revealed an excited expression. Dake looked at the clock and immediately said, We still have 10 minutes. As soon as he said that, Professor Shi-Erfu grabbed his arm. A gentle wind swept over and instantly wrapped around him and the Greed slime too. Wait for me. Professor Ka Zaire raised his hand and saw that Dake had already turned into the wind. He looked at Sister Kalien and suddenly shrugged. He said, Looks like we're in luck. Good morning. It's not convenient for the annual meeting, so I won't post any pictures. Good luck tomorrow. Please vote and recommend me. Chapter 671. The worst-case scenario did not happen. Not only did Greedy Slime 2 smell the scent of the brain demon, but it also quickly determined the direction. However, such a fast speed meant that there was only one target in its perception range. In short, it was useless to think too much. Relying on Professor Shirfa's wind spirit, they quickly traveled through the castle. Even if they stopped to determine the direction, it only took them 2 minutes to find the target. However, the other two were deeply surprised by the target. Lily, what are you doing here? Professor Shirfa looked at Lily, who was sitting on the windowsill and humming a song. Professor Shirfa's tone became more serious. Dake's eyes were already attracted by the toy in Lily's hand. It was a ball of transparent liquid that looked like a slime. If his guess was correct, it should be a complete brain fluid demon. Looking at this brain liquid demon, 3 black lines appeared on Dark's forehead. Remember, https://m, but can't you? VIP. Of course, he didn't think that Lily was the one who planted the brain liquid demon in Vern Morse's brain, but there was no doubt that they had encountered an obstacle. However, Professor Lily turned her head and asked curiously, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" Professor Shirfa looked at her excited face and suddenly became angry. "Lily, did you go to the dueling hall this afternoon?" Professor Lily squeezed the brain demon in her hand and said with a smile, "I wanted to walk around, but I suddenly found a water elemental on the way, so I followed it." "How does this brain demon look like a water elemental?" Professor Shirfa's forehead twitched again. "Although the brain demon looks like a water elemental. The brain demon looked like a jellyfish, but it only had 2 tentacles. Its main body was like a brain covered with a layer of water film. However, because it was as transparent as water, the internal structure of the brain was not obvious, and there was no disgusting feeling. The brain liquid demon was in Professor Lily's hand, and it looked like it had nothing to live for." Professor Shirfa took a deep breath and asked, "Do you remember where you found it?" Professor Lily said without thinking, "It's near the Knight Institute's tower." "What's wrong with it?" "Knight's Academy?" Professor Shirfa said, "The creature in your hand looks like a water elemental, but it's actually a brain fluid demon. I think even if you haven't seen it, you should have heard of it." Brain liquid demon. Is this it? Professor Lily immediately held the brain liquid demon up high and carefully observed it under the sunlight. Not only was he not afraid, but he was even more interested. "All right, when this is over, you'll have plenty of time to observe," Professor Shirfa quickly said. "I'll briefly tell you what happened, and then you'll follow us." Professor Lily immediately sat up straight and obediently listened to the story. However, Professor Shirfa obviously did not have the patience to tell the story in detail. It only took him 2 minutes to explain the matter, and then he immediately said, "Let's go to the place where you found the brain liquid demon first, and then we'll ask Dake's slime to try." "Okay, I'll lead the way." The uneventful academy life had long made the little fairy bored. Professor Lily instantly spread his dragonfly-like wings, grabbed the 2 tentacles of the brain liquid demon, and flew up into the sky. "Let's go too." Professor Shirfa grabbed Dake's wrist, and suddenly, a cool breeze blew over and wrapped the greedy slime 2 in it. Then, the 3 of them flew to the top of the castle at an extremely fast speed, and flew toward the Knight Institute's tower. Not long after, the Knight Institute's tower was in front of them. Professor Lily suddenly stopped, and he was almost at the same height as the top of the tower. Immediately after, a gust of wind swirled in the air, forming a platform in the air. After Professor Shirfa stopped, he placed Dake and the greedy slime 2 on the platform. Then she quickly said, "Let's try again." Dake looked at the brain liquid demon in Lily's hand and said, "Use that." Professor Shirfa nodded and said, "Lily, give it to me." "Okay." Professor Lily excitedly handed the brain liquid demon over. Dake reached out and took it. He felt that it was cold to the touch, and it was slightly sticky. It felt slightly different from its watery appearance. He tried to pinch it, and the brain liquid demon, that didn't react at all to Professor Lily's pinch, suddenly let out a shriek. Its 2 tentacles instantly rose up and fiercely pierced the blood vessels on his wrist. However, in the next second, the brain liquid demon's body emitted a faint white light, and it couldn't move anymore. It's still a piece of trash that bullies the weak and fears the strong. Dake shook his head slightly and placed it in front of the greedy slime too. He said, I'll leave the rest to you. Ouch! The greedy slime too stretched out its tentacles and hugged it. Then it narrowed its eyes and carefully sensed it. However, after a while, it violently shook its head, and its eyes were filled with disappointment. Dake and Professor Shi-Erfu looked at each other and understood. Professor Shi-Erfu looked down at the Night Institute's tower and said in a low voice, It seems that the one Lily picked up is a fish that slipped through the net. Anyway, let's take this brain liquid demon back to Kazair. When they returned to the infirmary, Professor Kazair was drinking tea at the table. Vern Morse hadn't woken up yet, and the root of the brain liquid demon was taken away by Dake and the others. He could only drink some tea and wait patiently. Sister Kalien, on the other hand, was quite busy. She hadn't stopped since the beginning. Professor Kazair was quite relaxed at first, but when he saw Professor Lily following Dake and Shi-Erfu in, he suddenly had a bad feeling. However, his attention was quickly attracted by the brain liquid demon in Lily's hand. He immediately put down his teacup and stood up. Did you find it? Professor Shi-Erfu shook his head and quickly said, Although I don't know what this brain liquid demon is, it was caught by Lily before we found it. Professor Kazair. So when Lily caught it, did she find any clues? Professor Shi-Erfu immediately stared at Lily. However, Lily was completely unfazed. But I don't know. Professor Kazair immediately knew that it wasn't that she couldn't find any clues. It was just that she didn't want to find any clues at all. Maybe when she was catching the brain liquid demon, the person behind the scenes was hiding behind her anxiously. Professor Kazair said helplessly, There's nothing we can do about it. Anyway, let me take a look at the brain liquid demon in your hand. Lily immediately smiled and took the brain liquid demon. After Professor Kazair took the brain liquid demon, his eyes narrowed slightly as he said, A complete brain liquid demon is rare. However, now wasn't a good time to do research. Professor Kazair wasn't someone who didn't know when to stop. He just used a simple experiment to confirm the birth time of this brain liquid demon. He was a little surprised and said, This brain liquid demon was born less than half a month ago? When Professor Shi-Erfu heard this, he had an idea. He said, I'll go and check if anyone went in or out in the past half a month. Professor Kazair nodded and said, Since we can't rely on Dake's slimes to find it, we'll have to check everything. Professor Shi-Erfu said, If no one went out, it means that the person who raised this brain liquid demon must still be in the school. This is very important. Professor Kazair said, It's necessary to narrow down the scope of the investigation. Since Lily found the brain liquid demon near the Night Institute tower, we'll start with the Night Institute. Dake suddenly said, Aren't we going to confirm the situation of the professors first? Professor Kazair turned his head and said with a smile, Of course the professors first. In the Shungmalian Academy, the most threatening group of people was the professors. If they didn't confirm that the professors had nothing to do with this matter, they wouldn't be at ease. The three of them confirmed the order of the investigation with a few words. Then, Professor Shi-Erfu immediately went to check the records. After Professor Shi-Erfu left quickly, Professor Kazair and Dake looked at each other and immediately said, In that case, let's start with us. Start with what? Professor Lily asked curiously. Professor Kazair looked at her and said, Confirm that this matter wasn't done by you or me. Do we still need to confirm this? Professor Lily pouted her lips in dissatisfaction. However, the investigation still started. Professor Kazair said, First, we need to clarify something. Dake asked, What is it? Professor Kazair said, The cultivation of the brain liquid demon is not a serious violation of the rules. The real violation is that the breeder planted the brain liquid demon in other people's minds. In other words, we don't care what they research, we only care about what they use it for. For example, the one who makes the butcher's knife is the general, and the one who uses the knife to slaughter a city is the butcher. Dake nodded and agreed. If it was just the cultivation of the brain liquid demon, the matter of refining demons, devils, and other magical spirits was obviously more serious. The Shungmalian Academy wouldn't treat these students differently because of this. Professor Ka-Zair saw that he understood and said, "This matter itself isn't a big deal. Vern Morse is also very healthy. We need to use the above concepts to clarify this statement. Then we can calm people down." Dake nodded again to show that he understood. Using a correct concept as the foundation, it led to a wrong assumption. The purpose was to prevent the breeder from doing anything desperate. Professor Ka-Zair asked, "Do you have any other ideas?" Dake thought for a while and suddenly said, "Then during the investigation, why don't we bring the brain liquid demon with us to show the Academy's attitude towards this kind of cultivation? I mean, we can temporarily treat it as a magical animal of the Magical Zoology Society." Professor Ka-Zair picked up the brain liquid demon and shook it. He said, "It's feasible." Dake suddenly showed a sly smile. "When the time comes, I'll lend it to you for research." Professor Ka-Zair suddenly laughed. "Then that's it for the time being. I'll ask you a few questions first." Dake immediately sat up straight and said, "Ask away." Professor Ka-Zair nodded and said, "Don't use the underworld magic. How much do you know about the brain liquid demon?" Dake said, "Very simple." Then the second question, Professor Ka-Zair said, "Before today, have you ever seen a brain liquid demon with your own eyes?" Dake shook his head and said, "No, I haven't." Professor Ka-Zair asked again, "Before today, have you ever thought about cultivating a brain liquid demon?" Dake shook his head again. "No." Professor Ka-Zair said gently. Then the last question, "Did you cultivate this brain liquid demon?" Dake shook his head. "Of course not." Professor Ka-Zair nodded and said, "Do you have anything else to add?" Dake thought for a while and said, "Let's add one more. Do you know Vern Morse?" Professor Ka-Zair blinked and suddenly said, "That's a good question. Then do you know Vern Morse?" Dake said, "Of course I do." If he said he didn't know, then there would be a real problem. Professor Ka-Zair said, "Then let's end this here. Summon your magic guide spirit. Summon the one that can read minds." Dake focused and quickly said in his mind to cancel the summoning of the goddess of the mind's eye and summon it to his side. The goddess of the mind's eye was obviously not used to this kind of behavior, but she quickly adjusted and looked at Dake. Dake introduced to Professor Ka-Zair, "This is the goddess of the mind's eye that I just cultivated not long ago. It can see through minds." Professor Ka-Zair was slightly surprised. "Is it a god's card?" Dake smiled and said, "That depends on how you define it." Ka-Zair shook his head and said, "Now it's your turn to ask me questions." Dake changed his set of questions slightly and asked again. Professor Ka-Zair answered them one by one. After he finished answering, Dake stood up and gave his seat to the goddess of the mind's eye. Then he let Professor Lily sit opposite him and let the goddess of the mind's eye ask the questions. As she asked, Dake explained to her so that she gradually understood the situation. Then Dake summoned another, goddess of the mind's eye, that didn't have intelligence to try. But it didn't work. Once the inspection began, the breeders would definitely prepare for it, and the questions would need to be changed at any time. If it didn't have intelligence, it would be difficult to deal with it. When Professor Shi-Erfu returned, the 4 people in the infirmary had finished the self-inspection. Everyone looked at Professor Shi-Erfu and waited for her results. Professor Shi-Erfu said, "We're lucky. There haven't been many people in and out of the college in the past half a month. But I'm afraid we have to check the merchants on Traveler's Street. The workload doubled in an instant. It happened so suddenly that I took 2 more days off. I'm very sorry. When the notebook is delivered, I'll start to make up for this month's update. There are still 180,000 words left before the 200,000 words in December. Let's go." Chapter 672. The merchants on Traveler's Street were always easy to ignore, but in fact, they were also part of the college. And unlike the professors and students who generally did not go in and out of the college, the merchants had to go back and forth between Traveler's Street and the college town every week. Therefore, they were the most mobile group. The only good thing was that, except for a few people, The merchants were not allowed to enter the castle through the teleportation hub. This meant that the possibility of the brain liquid demon being cultivated by them was very low. Now that the situation was urgent, Professor Earbook decided to first investigate the merchants who could enter the castle, including Eve. First, we'll start with the school staff who have been in and out of the castle this month. Then we'll investigate a few merchants on Traveler's Street. And then we'll start with the professors. Professor Earbook quickly formulated a plan and immediately began to execute it. It was faster than Dake expected. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the first batch of people to be investigated had been brought to the auditorium, banquet hall, on the first floor. First website. https://m. Vipcanchu. VIP as the main force in charge of the investigation. He and Professor Kazair sat in the teachers' seats, with Professor Lili and Sister Karen as assistants. The staff and merchants who were brought to the auditorium were still confused at this time. Professor Earbook did not disclose any information to them. For this batch of people, Professor Dake and Professor Kazair used the simplest and fastest method of investigation. They placed the complete brain liquid demon in the middle of the table, then placed a desk in front of each person. Professor Lili controlled the little fairy to put the pre-printed answer sheet on the desk. When someone finished answering, the fairy would replace the answer sheet. The people who needed to be investigated lined up in 2 rows behind the 2 desks and sat down one by one to answer the questions. In this way, Professor Dake and Professor Kazair did not need to waste time and did not need to worry about the answers being leaked. Although it did not matter whether the answers were leaked or not, they needed to show a message to the outside world. Let those people mistakenly think that they were investigating by answering the questions, and nothing else. In particular, they could not let people know that they had the mind-reading ability. The investigation went smoothly. The first answer that Professor Dake and Professor Kazair wrote on their answer sheets was, "What is the creature on the table?" Brain liquid demon was a name that countless people feared during the war, but it quickly disappeared after the war ended. The number of people who had seen the true body of the brain liquid demon could be counted with one hand. The vast majority of people, including the soldiers who had directly faced the brain fluid demon, believed that it should be something as ugly as the devil. He would never have thought that the jellyfish, that was as pure as water on the table, was the real body of the brain liquid demon. The merchants of Traveler's Street and the staff of the academy rarely had enough knowledge to recognize it. Therefore, almost no one could answer the first question. However, this had little to do with the investigation this time. He was someone who could cultivate a brain liquid demon, so it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that he was a researcher with special knowledge about the brain. And for this kind of person, memory manipulation was probably just a small trick. It was very likely that he predicted that after this investigation, he would do something to his own memory and completely seal his memory of the brain liquid demon. This way, his answer would be no different from an ordinary person. What Professor Dake and Professor Kazair needed to do was to use mind reading to find flaws in their thoughts while they were answering the questions. Of course, to be precise, it was mind zygotis and Professor Kazair. Whether it was the brain liquid demon on the table or the questions on the answer sheet, they were all there to draw out their thoughts. Dake quickly gave his seat to mind zygotis. In order to make it more dignified, he gave mind zygotis an older version of her skin. In just half an hour, the results of the first investigation came out. Other than a few people, including Eve, no one knew about the brain liquid demon. There were a lot of people who knew the name Vern Morse, but when he was mentioned, these people didn't have any special thoughts. We can't be 100% sure that they have nothing to do with the brain liquid demon. But we can let them go first. Professor Kazair concluded. After the investigation, Dake took the opportunity to find Eve. He made an appointment with her and let her go. Then the professors who were notified also came one by one. The professors at the Shungmalian Academy, other than teaching, actually lived in seclusion. They relied on the rich resources of the Shungmalian Academy and were addicted to research all day long. This time, in order to conduct a comprehensive investigation, Professor Earbook called all the professors who could be present. Moreover, she had been a spectator during the investigation. Once a professor exposed himself and hurt someone, she would immediately suppress him. Dake sat next to Mind's-Eye Goddess. He was replenishing her mana while observing the professors present. He didn't know the names of many of the professors, but each of them was stronger than the last. For these professors, simple answer sheets were no longer useful. Professor Kazair set up a one-way barrier around the teachers' seats, so that people outside the barrier couldn't see or hear. The people inside the barrier were not affected at all. Then, Professor Lily controlled the ferry to freely shuttle around the edge of the barrier, leading the people waiting in line one by one. Dake and Professor Kazair verbally asked them questions inside the barrier. But after a few people, they ran into trouble. Professor Halderboyd, can you open up your brain a little? Dake said helplessly to the professor of magic language, Halderboyd. Mind's-Eye. This ability was not impossible to guard against. It was just that the methods needed to guard against it were relatively rare, and the level of the magus was extremely high. And on a daily basis, very few people would guard their brain to death. But unfortunately, Professor Boyd was one of them. Mind's-Eye Goddess could not see through his mind at all. And since she couldn't see through it, she naturally couldn't investigate it. Dake could only ask him to open up his brain on his own. But Professor Halderboyd immediately frowned and asked, why? As usual, Professor Halderboyd had naturally curly dark brown hair. The skin on his face was slightly dry, and his nose was as prominent as an eagle's hook. His eyes were slightly sinister. When he asked the question, his tone was as sharp as a knife. But Dake was already used to his tone, so he immediately said, cooperate with the investigation. Professor Halderboyd raised his eyebrows and said, although I can roughly guess the reason, I'm sorry, I can't open up my brain for people to spy on me. Dake tried his best to persuade him, Professor, it's just a temporary opening. I won't pry into your other thoughts. But Professor Halderboyd still shook his head and said, impossible. Dake was a little helpless, so he could only turn to Professor Kazair for help. But after Professor Kazair checked one of the professors, he immediately said, forget about Boyd, it can't be him. Dake was a little startled, and he turned to look at Professor Shierfu. When Professor Shierfu nodded, he said to Professor Halderboyd, in that case, I'll just ask a simple question. Professor Boyd, do you know Vern Morse? Of course I do. Professor Boyd said directly, Vern Morse, a fifth-year student of the House of Fools. He's a clown. Dake blinked and said, Professor, it's not good to talk about a student like that. But Professor Halderboyd said nonchalantly, he's not my student. Dake said, okay, Professor. Please leave this way. Next. After Professor Halderboyd left, the next professor was invited in by Little Fairy. Dake asked and knew the name of the professor. Then, he asked the questions according to the plan. Although the professor was a little stubborn, he was not as difficult to deal with as Professor Halderboyd. Dake quickly finished checking him, and then he moved on to the next professor. Because it took a long time to check each professor, the whole process was very slow. Dake also met Professor Ryan Hacks after that. As a second-year professor of the history of magic, Professor Ryan Hacks had completely adapted to the environment. His teaching style was also quickly adapting. Recently, he had a tendency to be close to Professor Didi. After a brief conversation with him, Dake asked casually, Professor Hacks, haven't you achieved your goal of joining the Shungmalian? Goal? What goal? Professor Ryan Hacks asked with a puzzled look. Dake looked up at him and said, didn't you say you wanted to be re-employed? Oh, you're talking about that. Professor Ryan Hacks suddenly had a look of realization. That was just last year's goal. This year I already have a new goal. Dake asked curiously, what goal? Professor Ryan Hacks looked at Professor Kazair and said, Kazair said I have some talent in magic. Dake's heart skipped a beat. He said, Professor Hacks, are you going to start learning magic from scratch? Professor Ryan Hacks said with a troubled look, yes. I know it's difficult, but there's always hope, right? Isn't the Shungmalian Academy always called the place of miracles? I hope a miracle will favor me. Dake nodded and said, good luck, Professor. Your question is over. Please leave. After Professor Ryan Hacks left, Dake immediately turned to the goddess of the mind's eye. However, the goddess of the mind's eye just shook her head and said, "His words and actions are exactly the same. But this is strange. Humans' thoughts are always slightly different from their words and actions, because humans are always making choices." Dake pondered for a moment and said, "Professor Ryan Hacks may have other ideas, but he is not a researcher. The probability of him being related to the brain fluid demon is not high. Let's not worry about it for now." Immediately after, the next professor walked into the barrier. He was a professor in charge of arithmetic. The entire investigation process was carried out until 6 o'clock in the evening. Dake directly ate with Professor Kazair and the others in the auditorium and quickly discussed. Most of the professors were very cooperative. A few of them, like Professor Holdren Boyd, were also guaranteed by a few professors. The final result was a relief. As long as the breeder is not a professor, the situation is not bad. Professor Kazair analyzed. The threat that a student can cause is ultimately limited. Maybe this brain fluid demon is just a product of a student's curiosity. Dake said, but no normal student would implant a brain fluid demon into a fellow student out of curiosity. Professor Kazair laughed and said, in short, since the target has been narrowed down to students, then based on this analysis, there are not many students who have the ability to implant a brain fluid demon into Fernmore's brain. We can further narrow down the scope. Dake shook his head and said, no one can be sure that it's not a first-year student. Professor, you should know that it only takes a sleeping potion to knock out a fifth-year student. That's true, Professor Kazair said. Then we'll have to continue working hard. Dake said, this is nothing. Professor Shierfu raised his head and said, I've already asked someone to arrange it. Tonight we'll investigate the students of the Knights Institute. How about it? Professor Kazair said, it's not a big problem. After all, Lily caught the brain fluid demon near the tower of the Knights Institute. The possibility that the breeder is a student of the Knights Institute is not low. Professor Shierfu said, considering that Fernmore is a student of the House of Fools. The second in line is the House of Fools. After that, it's more likely that it's a student of the School of Magic. Finally, it's the House of Nobles. That's basically it. I hope that we can find the breeder. I don't want to see the brain fluid demon implanted in someone else's brain. After hearing this, Dake asked curiously, Professor, if we find the breeder, what should we do? Professor Shierfu couldn't help but frown. The first thing she thought of was, of course, to fire the breeder. However, considering that the breeder was able to cultivate a life form like the brain fluid demon from nothing, he must be very accomplished in this area. If he was a talent that could be molded, Principal Erdii will make the decision on this matter. Professor Shierfu's sternness on the surface was just a cover. She was actually a gentle person. She continued, depending on the specific situation, a different decision may be made. If it's really bad, we can't rule out the possibility of sending him to court. Dake nodded slightly and thought carefully. He was actually very interested in the brain fluid demon's information, because this thing always gave him a very similar feeling to the magical brain dropper. And his magical brain dropper had gradually become different. Good morning. Chapter 673. In the evening, except for the students who went to the underground city and could not receive the notice, everyone was urgently recalled to the castle and coordinated by the year leaders. There were nearly 1,000 students in the Shungmalian Academy, and there were about 250 students in the Night Academy. If they only relied on Goddess of the Mind's Eye and Professor Kazair to investigate, it would take more than 2 hours to investigate everyone, even if one person per minute. What's more, one person per minute was not realistic. Therefore, Dake was mentally prepared for a long battle. In the tower of the Night Academy, Ai Mortis, the well-deserved first seat of the second-year Night Academy, did not put down her book even at this time. But her mind was not on the book. What happened? The news of what happened in the open-air duel hall at 1 o'clock in the afternoon had already spread. Remember the website, MVIP, can't you? 6. Everyone knew that the fifth-year senior, Vern Morse, was defeated by the second-year Dake Dimming and lost his mind to attack him. Some people noticed that something was wrong with Vern Morse, while others did not. But this matter quickly spread, and even those who did not see it could tell from various analyses. Therefore, some people speculated whether there was something wrong with Vern Morse's mental state. The most likely illness was mental illness, or UU syndrome. In addition, Vern Morse's behavior had always been incompatible with the people around him. After all, no one would dye their hair colorful and sprinkle fluorescent powder. This undoubtedly confirmed the speculation that he was mentally ill. But when the news spread like crazy, few people realized the seriousness of this matter. The Shungmalian Academy always gave people the illusion of omnipotence, so the students seriously lacked a sense of crisis in the academy. Ai-Ma did not see the duel, so she could only analyze the incident through hearsay. But she also thought that it was not a big deal, at least compared to the events that happened last year. It was just a student who lost control, which was a very common thing. Until the branch card vibrated, and all the students received the notice to return to the tower. She realized the seriousness of this matter. So she became more and more curious. What happened? But this incident was kept secret very well. Maybe the response was too fast, so the news did not have time to leak. In short, nobody in the Tower of the Knights Academy knew the exact news. White Gouda and Luobot Broheim, who were also sophomores, were also discussing wildly near her. However, White Gouda had seen the duel, and he seemed to have vaguely sensed something. In such a noisy environment, the students of the Knight Academy once again received a notice from the vice principal, Sarashi Urfu, through their academy card. They lined up according to their grades and headed to the auditorium on the first floor, under the lead of their respective grade leaders. Ai-Ma Modis was entrusted with the important task of temporarily becoming the class leader of the first years. She had no choice but to close the book in her hand and gather the first years. However, the first-year students of the Knight Academy were too mischievous. Although she had obtained a list of names, she was completely unable to match the faces of the first-year students with their names. Ai-Ma realized that he lacked prestige. However, she quickly thought of a solution. Phoenix, who was originally standing silently in the crowd, was suddenly called out by Ai-Ma. Although she was very low-key in the Knight Academy, she was the magic fairy of Professor Dake Dimming. Although her identity as a magic fairy had been leaked, no one knew that she was actually the magic fairy of the Valkyrie Arvet. Otherwise, she would be even more respected in the Knight Academy. In short, thanks to her identity, her words were still somewhat effective. With Phoenix as an assistant, Ai-Ma finally managed to control the group of first-year students. Ready, we are going. The vice principal is waiting for us in the auditorium. After the team was organized, Ai-Ma pushed open the gate of the Knight Academy tower. The students of the Knight Academy were like a long dragon winding out of the tower. The castle, which had become cold because all the students were recalled to the tower, finally regained some vitality. However, when the students of the 6th grade of the Knight Academy all entered the auditorium on the first floor, the vitality that had been restored with great difficulty disappeared again. It was the beginning of the weekend, but the castle was terrifyingly quiet. It was filled with the aura of a mountain storm. After the students entered the auditorium, they suddenly felt an invisible pressure. As many as 20 professors were distributed in every corner of the auditorium. There were even 2 professors guarding the door. It was as if the auditorium was a huge cage, and once you entered, you would never be able to come out again. The students' faces gradually darkened. No one was joking anymore. This time, the first-year students were in front, and the 6th-year students were behind them. As the interim leader of the first-year students, Ai-Ma Modis walked at the head of the class. She carried a lot of pressure and walked to the teachers' seats where several professors were sitting. She saw the vice principal, Professor Shi Erfu, and Dake Dimming. Why is Dake here? Oh, that's right. He is the person involved in this incident. With this thought in mind, Ai-Ma walked to the front of the teachers' seats. Professor Shi Erfu walked over and told them what to do next. Then, a barrier rose around the teachers' seats, and no one could see inside from the outside. Do you want to be the first to be tested? Professor Shi Erfu asked. AI Ma looked at the barrier that was only a step away and hurriedly said, "No, I should be back to the second year." "Okay." Professor Shi Erfu praised her. "Thank you for bringing the first-year students here. You can go back for the time being." AI Ma felt the vibration of her school card and knew that she had received a new amount of credits. She couldn't help but smile. After saluting Professor Shi Erfu, she returned to the second year. Then Phoenix dimming became the first to be tested. "Let's begin." Professor Shi Erfu clapped his hands and let Phoenix enter the barrier first, followed by the second. Phoenix actually didn't need to be tested the most. However, according to the procedure, she still appeared in front of Dake. "Don't be nervous." Dake gestured for her to sit down and picked 3 questions to ask. On the other side of the barrier, another first-year student of the Night Academy was also being questioned by Professor Kazair. The investigation of the students was on the right track. The first-year students were used to Dake dimming standing on the professor's side, so they were very cooperative. At first, Dake was the one who asked the questions. Later, he completely handed it over to the goddess of the mind's eye, while he himself only observed and recorded. After half an hour, Spike Leon of the Orc royal family entered the barrier. Dake's heart skipped a beat, and he gestured for him to sit down first. He had always wondered the real reason why Spike Leon entered the Shungmalian Academy. Now was undoubtedly a good time to get the answer. However, prying into other people's private matters was not in line with his morals. After a little hesitation, he personally asked, "Spike, look here. Do you know what kind of creature this is?" "Brain fluid demon." Unexpectedly, Spike Leon suddenly blurted out. Dake suddenly came back to his senses and asked slightly seriously, "How do you know?" Spike Leon was slightly proud. "I've seen brain fluid demon before, in the palace's collection room." Dake pondered for a moment and said, "Then do you know how to cultivate brain fluid demon?" Spike Leon immediately shook his head. "That's something that the scholars need to research. I'm not interested in it." Dake's eyes turned and asked, "Do you know Vern Morse? Is it that student?" Spike's eyes suddenly lit up, and he clapped his hands. "I understand. Vern Morse has been parasitized by the brain fluid demon. You don't need to worry about that." Dake pointed at the exit, indicating that he could leave. Although Spike Leon still wanted to ask, under the threat of Dake's gaze, he obediently left through the door. However, he was not sent out of the auditorium, but was ordered to sit at the long table of the Night Academy. Tonight's workload was huge. Considering the necessity of confidentiality, the professors were already mentally prepared to work through the night. After Spike Leon left, Dake put it behind his name, as a mark of importance. Although Spike Leon didn't show any signs of suspicion, his excessive understanding of the brain fluid demon made him a relatively suspicious target. Dake asked the goddess of the mind's eye, "Did you see anything?" The goddess of the mind's eye was frowning, and at this time she whispered, "Half of his soul is in a frozen state." Dake suddenly realized, and added 2 behind Spike Leon's name. Excessive understanding of the brain fluid demon, and half of his soul being sealed. These 2 conditions added together made Spike Leon the focus of attention. Is this the reason why he's so stupid? Dake could not help but think. Could it be that the reason he came to the Shungmalian Academy was to remove the seal on his soul? But he quickly realized, this could also be a special method used to deal with the investigation. By sealing a part of his soul, he could make himself flawless. But when people do this kind of thing, they often forget one thing. The blank space left behind after being sealed would be even more obvious. The structure of Spike Leon's soul could be seen clearly in front of the goddess of the mind's eye. The first 3-star target, Dake said to Professor Li, who had been keeping his mouth shut. Inform Professor Shi Erfu to pay close attention. We can't let him have any other problems during this period. Then he continued to investigate. Seeing that the line of the first years of the Night Academy was getting shorter and shorter, the second years at the back gradually became nervous. AI Mamodi stood at the front and whispered to the second-year leader, Justin Wayne. Both of them looked slightly dignified. White Gouda and Luo Boatbroheim were still surprised by why Dake was sitting in the teacher's seat. AI Ma's previous assumption was obviously not valid. Dake was definitely not sitting there as the person involved. He looks like a professor. White Gouda could not help but say. No, he's a professor. Luobot Broheim corrected. The second years all knew that Dake Dimming taught mathematics in the first year. Okay, he's a professor. White Gouda could not help but say. So how can we catch up to a professor? Luobot Broheim laughed and thought, who knows? White Gouda could not help but ponder. The investigation of the first years of the Night Academy was finally over. Dake and Professor Kazair had a 3-minute discussion about the investigation results, then continued to investigate the second years. Professor Kazair found 2 suspicious targets, and so did Dake. Other than Spike Leon, there was also a girl, who was a spy. There had always been spies from various forces among the students of St. Marian College. Although the professors knew about it, they all turned a blind eye. As long as the spies did not do anything overboard, Shangmalian Academy itself was not shameful. They only treated the spies as ordinary students. But now, because of the brain liquid demon incident, the spies were naturally exposed. After Dake caught the girl, he suddenly realized that this was the case. He quietly sent her away, then put 2 stars behind her name. This way, maybe I can also find the person who wanted to lure me into the underground city to find the holy sword. Dake could not help but think. He actually wanted to know who the mastermind was. Why was he so kind? The investigation of the second years of the Night Academy finally began. Aima Métis walked into the barrier where Dake was and sat down on the stool. She was slightly surprised to see Dake Dimming sitting in front of her. Dake saw Aima and relaxed a little, then said, Aima, I need to ask you a few questions. You just have to answer normally. What happened? Aima immediately asked. This is a secret, Dake said. Okay. Aima's gaze quickly focused on the brain liquid demon, and exclaimed without hesitation, Brain liquid demon? Seems like you have some understanding of the brain liquid demon, Dake said. Aima immediately said, Of course. Brain liquid demon is a product created by the demon race using alchemy. When you were studying alchemy, didn't you try to understand the relevant knowledge? Dake was startled and his cheeks were slightly red. I've been busy during this period. Aima clicked her tongue and said, I understand. Vern Morse was parasitized by the brain liquid demon. Right? You guys made such a big fuss just to find the person who implanted the brain liquid demon in his brain. So, how do you want to find it? Her gaze quickly swept over Professor Li and the heart-eye goddess beside Dake, and she directly pointed out. It's that magic elf, right? It can read minds? Good morning, *3, epsilon *. Chapter 674. Mind's Eye Goddess smiled at Aima, and the third eye between her eyebrows glowed faintly under the cover of Professor Li's spell. Aima suddenly became alert, but Mind's Eye Goddess already knew what she was thinking. Even if she knew that Mind's Eye Goddess could read minds, there was no effective way to deal with it. This made her very angry, and she glared at Mind's Eye Goddess. But what she got in response was Mind's Eye Goddess' ridicule. Ahem. Dake quickly coughed to attract her attention, and then said, Aima, if you have any ideas, you can say it. Aima looked away and tried not to think about other things. I have nothing to say. Do you want to go through the procedure or just skip it? Of course, she wanted to skip it, but Dake chose to go through the procedure. Although the efficiency of a comprehensive inspection was extremely low, it was indeed an effective method. Remember, https://m, VIP can't you? VIP. However, he was very familiar with the second-year students and basically confirmed that there were no suspicious people, so he was relatively relaxed when inspecting the second-year students until White Gouda walked into the barrier. Hi, Dake. White Gouda walked in and raised her hand to greet him. Dake glanced next door and saw Luobot Broheim being inspected by Professor Kazair. He nodded and said, Good evening, White. Sit down first. White sat down and asked curiously, Is the late-night inspection because of Vern Morse? He had experience in this area. Dake nodded slightly and waited for him to sit down, then said, I need to ask you a few questions. Just answer truthfully. White glanced at him and looked at the other two people at the teacher's table. One of them was a long-haired woman he had never seen before, and the other was Professor Lily, who was sitting upright. Even though White wondered why Dake Deming was sitting in the middle instead of Professor Lily, he didn't say anything. However, he didn't know that his thoughts had been completely seen by the goddess of the mind's eye. Dake saw that he had no reaction, so he followed the usual procedure and pointed at the brain liquid demon and asked, "Do you know what this is?" White looked at it carefully and said hesitantly, "Slime? Or a jellyfish?" Dake looked at Mind's Eye Goddess, and she nodded at him. Dake said, "Then I'll leave it to you to ask." "Yes, master." After the goddess of the heart got her instructions, she asked White Gouda under her surprised gaze, "Since you don't even know what the brain demon is, you can't possibly be the breeder. Have you come in contact with Fern Morse?" "No," White Gouda immediately retorted. "I know what the brain liquid demon is." The goddess of the heart frowned and asked, "What is the brain liquid demon?" White Gouda raised his eyebrows and said quickly, "A demon that feeds on brains." The goddess of the heart smirked and said with a sneer, "Is this what you mean by you know? Then how did you know about the brain liquid demon?" "Of course from." White Gouda was suddenly stunned, but he didn't stop talking. "Of course someone told me." "Then it seems that someone only knows half of it." The goddess of the heart said lightly, "Since you can't even recognize the brain liquid demon right in front of you, don't say that you know. Please answer my question again. Have you come in contact with Fern Morse?" White Gouda didn't look happy and said directly, "Why would I come in contact with a senior from the House of Fools?" As soon as he said that, the goddess of the heart turned to Dake. Dark nodded at her, and the Heart's Eye Goddess said, "You can leave now." White Gouda walked out of the exit in shock. He really didn't know how he had offended that woman. After he left, Dark asked in a low voice, "What did you see?" The goddess of the heart's face became serious. "He might have nothing to do with the brain liquid demon, but I saw a fog in his heart." "Fog?" Dake couldn't help but frown. The goddess of the heart said, "There's a layer of fog shrouding his heart, so he can't be seen. Of course, that layer of fog is still too thin, so I can easily see through it." Dake asked, "That layer of fog, is it good or bad? Is it something he knows or doesn't know? Is it controllable or uncontrollable?" The goddess of the heart whispered, "Since I didn't see anything when I peeped, I can tell that he doesn't know. We can't rule out the possibility that there's something parasitic in his body that needs that layer of fog to hide its presence." Dake frowned. "Isn't it the brain liquid demon?" The goddess of the heart shook her head and said, "That should be something on a completely different level." Dake was even more confused. He often meets with the blood concubine. If there's something parasitic in him, it's impossible to hide it from the blood concubine. "Professor Lily, what do you think?" Lily's eyes suddenly widened. Lily isn't sleeping." Dake. This kind of mechanical inspection work was indeed a little boring for the little fairy. Dake. "Why don't you go somewhere else to sleep?" Lily. "I already said that I'm not sleeping. If you continue like this, Lily is going to get angry." Dake turned around and put 3 stars behind the White Gouda's name. The abnormality of the White Gouda couldn't be ignored. Even though he wasn't the breeder, he was still someone to be paid attention to. The inspection of the 2nd grade ended quickly, then it was the 3rd grade's turn, followed by the 4th grade, 5th grade, and 6th grades. After the inspection of the 6th grade's Night Institute students was completed, Dake finally relaxed. He took a sip of tea and said, "Other than the students who went to the dungeon, everyone else should have been inspected, right?" Professor Shierfu had already walked into the barrier, so he said, "It can't be wrong. The dungeon escape device has a record. Every student would wear the dungeon escape device when they entered the dungeon, and the school would use the dungeon escape device to locate the students. Although it wasn't very useful when entering the dungeon, it could be used to confirm who was in the dungeon." Dake nodded and said, "Then let's tally up the inspection results." He got up and walked around the goddess of the mind's eye to Professor Kazaer's side to do the statistics with him. Dake pointed at the notebook and said, On my side there are a total of 3 people marked with 3 stars, more with 2 stars and fewer with 1 star. My side isn't much different, Professor Ka-Zair said solemnly. There are 2 people marked with 3 stars, and 6 people marked with 2 stars and 1 star. I didn't expect there to be so many people in the school that we need to pay attention to, and this is only the Night Institute. I heard that the House of Fools is the most affected? Professor Shi-Erfu retorted. There are actually very few people who are problematic, and this isn't something we should be worrying about now. Dake said, then should we do the second round of inspection on the people we need to pay attention to, or should we start the inspection on the House of Fools as a whole? Professor Shi-Erfu looked at Professor Ka-Zair and asked, Ka-Zair, what do you think? Ka-Zair thought for a moment and said, I personally suggest that we do the second round of inspection first. I have 2 suspects in the College of Knights. If we can confirm it, we might not need to continue the inspection. Dake asked, is it the 2 people marked with 3 stars? No. Professor Ka-Zair shook his head and said, it's the 2 people marked with 1 star. Dake couldn't help but be surprised. If that's the case, why not just mark them with 3 stars? Professor Ka-Zair smiled and said, because they are only appropriately suspicious. Then, Professor Shi-Erfu gathered a total of 20 students according to the list and gathered them within the boundary of the teachers' seats. Among the 20 people they needed to pay attention to, a total of 12 were selected by Dake. Among them, there was a first-year student named Spike Leon and a second-year student named White Gouda, who were marked with 3 stars. There was also a 5th-year student. Andrew Moraton, who was also a 5th-year student like Vern Morse, was a strong and ordinary student who didn't seem to have any intelligence. But the goddess of the mines, I saw something strange in his soul. He was not only a magus, but also a rare wizard. Although wizards were also a type of magic profession, they were different from mages who were worshipped. Wizards usually needed all kinds of materials as a medium to cast spells. Therefore, they would always deal with crucibles and boil all kinds of herbs that emitted strange smells. These smells gradually accumulated and were difficult to get rid of, which created a dark impression of wizards. Xingmalian academies, potioneering, originated from wizards' technology. Andrew Moraton hid his identity until now and rarely used his potion card, even in magic duels. This made him unable to display his extraordinary strength, and his grades had always hovered around the middle. But in today's indiscriminate investigation, he was finally exposed. But in fact, his identity as a wizard only gave him extra points in the eyes of the professors, so there was no need to hide it at all. Unless he had a special reason, and a wizard who could create a brain fluid demon. It made sense. Plus, he was a classmate who frequently came into contact with Vern Morse, so the degree of suspicion was even higher. Professor Ka-Zair thought that the most suspicious targets were a first-year student and a fourth-year student. They were both from the Knights Academy, but the first-year student looked a little timid. Dake, as a first-year arithmetic professor, was naturally quite familiar with her. She was a girl named Julie Zaphoni, who had an average height for her age group. Her performance in class was also quite average, and when she was called to answer questions, her round face would show an extremely shy blush. But this was what made her suspicious, because she was a student of the Knights Academy. According to Professor Ka-Zair, Julie Zaphoni's heart was actually very wild, and she had at least 3 years of study time in Introduction to Magic. In other words, if she did not hide her strength, she could easily become the champion of this year's Knights Academy. Dake did not expect her to be such an excellent student, so he could not help but feel a little helpless when he saw her timidly walk into the barrier with her head lowered. The other fourth-year student that Professor Ka-Zair suspected was a boy named Cameron Macefield. This boy had mastered extremely high-end spiritual magic. According to Professor Ka-Zair, he should be a natural spiritual mage, and even Professor Ka-Zair could not easily see through his heart. Cameron Macefield was quite famous in the Knights Academy, unlike Andrew Moraton and Julie Zaphoni, who deliberately kept a low profile. If Professor Ka-Zair did not pretend to mention that Vern Morse might become an idiot due to the brain demon implantation, Professor Ka-Zair would not have suspected him of being a spiritual mage. In short, There were 5 most suspicious people in the Knights Academy. They were: first-year student Spike Leon, first-year student Julie Zaphoni, second-year student White Gouda, fourth-year student Cameron Macefield, fifth-year student Andrew Moraton. Among the other 15 people, there might be 3 to 5 spies. Dake and the others summoned all of them. On one hand, they did not want to make the 5 most suspicious people too nervous, and on the other hand, they wanted to keep the spies' mouths shut and not let them spread the news before the results were out. Of course, the second round of review was also carried out one by one. Professor Earbook still separated the teachers' seats and let Professor Lily manage one side. She, Dake, and Ka Zaire went to the other side and examined the 20 students one by one according to their grade. The first to come in was first-year student Spike Leon. Spike Leon sat upright on the chair. His spine was ramrod straight, and he naturally exuded a righteous aura like that of a lion. Dake had a good impression of him. He did not want to suspect him, but, "Spike, can you tell me more about your situation? If you want to come to the academy to ask for help, I think Professor Ka Zaire and Professor Earbook will be very willing to help you. The premise is that you have to tell them what happened to you in full detail." Dake looked into Spike Leon's eyes and said slowly. The tall orc prince, when facing this second-year student who was not that tall, suddenly had the illusion that he was the short one. He rubbed his hands very cautiously, but his face was full of hesitation. Good morning, good night. You're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.